These questions haunt the corridors of modern existence with relentless persistence. How do you live authentically when everything around you, your culture, your language, even your own habits of thought, pulls you toward conformity and superficiality? The morning commute, the social media feed, the endless cycle of work and consumption all whisper the same message: blend in, follow the patterns, accept the ready-made interpretations that anonymous others have prepared for you. Yet something within resists this drift toward the average and the everyday. Martin Heidegger called this resistance the call to authentic existence, and he dedicated his life to showing why answering that call reveals the deepest crisis facing Western civilization. The question deepens when you attempt genuine thinking. How do you think authentically when the very concepts you must use have been worn smooth by centuries of unthinking repetition? Words like existence, reality, truth, and being arrive already laden with assumptions, already channeled into familiar grooves of interpretation. Philosophy itself offers little help, having settled into comfortable academic routines that mistake scholarly debate for genuine inquiry. The most fundamental question of all, what does it mean for anything to exist, has been buried beneath layers of systematic theorizing and technical analysis. These are not abstract puzzles for philosophical entertainment. They represent the daily reality faced by anyone seeking genuine existence in a world of ready-made answers and anonymous public interpretations. The tension between authentic existence and conformist drift shapes every significant choice, every moment of reflection, every attempt to understand what matters most deeply about human life. In the Black Forest of southwestern Germany, along the winding paths that lead to a simple wooden hut in Tottenauberg, Heidegger wrestled with these questions as the lived tension of his existence, rather than mere philosophical problems. He walked these forest paths daily, grappling with the fundamental crisis of Western thought, while the mist rolled through the pine trees and the seasons turned in their ancient rhythm. Here was a thinker who had abandoned training for the Catholic priesthood to pursue philosophy, who had studied under the great phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, only to radically transform phenomenology beyond recognition. Heidegger wrote in German, but found himself compelled to invent an entirely new vocabulary because existing philosophical language had become dead and misleading. Words like Dasein, thrownness, fallenness, and being toward death emerged from his pen, not as academic jargon, but as desperate attempts to capture experiences that conventional language could no longer express. His rural origins in Baden-Württemberg, born in 1889 to a sexton and a farmer's daughter, shaped his acute sensitivity to the gap between authentic dwelling and modern uprootedness. This biographical context illuminates the revolutionary significance of Heidegger's diagnosis. He identified the deepest crisis of Western civilization, the complete forgetting of the question of being that had guided philosophy since its Greek origins. The question of being has today been forgotten, he declared, and this forgetting manifests everywhere in our technological age, where everything, including human beings themselves, becomes mere resources for manipulation and optimization. Trees become timber reserves, rivers become hydroelectric potential, and people become human capital or demographic units. The forgetting runs deeper than mere philosophical neglect. It represents a fundamental transformation in how humans relate to existence itself. Ancient Greek thinkers like Parmenides and Heraclitus lived in wonder at the sheer fact that anything exists at all. They asked the most basic question: what does it mean for something to be rather than not to be? Medieval philosophers preserved this sense of wonder through their contemplation of divine creation. But gradually, philosophy shifted its attention from the question of being to the analysis of particular beings and their properties. Modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes, became obsessed with how we can know reality rather than what it means for reality to exist. The question shifted from being to knowing, from ontology to epistemology. Science and technology emerged as the dominant modes of revealing truth, but they approach everything as objects to be measured, predicted, and controlled. The question of being itself, the mystery that anything exists at all, disappeared from view. This makes Heidegger's work not just historically important, but urgently contemporary. We live in the culmination of this forgetting, where technological thinking has become so total that we can barely imagine other ways of relating to existence. Understanding how we arrived at this point, and what possibilities remain for recovering authentic existence, forms the heart of Heidegger's philosophical journey. Part 1. The forgotten question of being. Western philosophy has spent over 2,000 years pursuing the wrong question. Heidegger's radical diagnosis cuts to the heart of our entire intellectual tradition. Whilst philosophers have exhaustively catalogued what beings are, they have forgotten to ask what it means for anything to be at all. In Being and Time, he observes that the question of the meaning of being must be formulated precisely because it has been forgotten, despite being remaining the most universal and the emptiest of concepts. This misdirection began with Plato's elevation of eternal forms as the really real, and crystallized through Aristotle's systematic categories of substance. What emerged was a pattern where being itself becomes invisible behind the beings we study, like light disappearing behind everything it illuminates. Each major epoch of Western thought has deepened this concealment rather than overcoming it. Greek philosophy established the template by treating being as the most general being. Medieval scholasticism transformed this into theological doctrine, making being into God as the supreme entity. Modern philosophy, from Descartes through German idealism, continued the pattern by grounding being in consciousness or absolute spirit. Throughout these transformations, metaphysics consistently violates Heidegger's fundamental insight that being is not a being. Instead of recognizing this ontological difference, each tradition makes being into another entity: Plato's good, Aristotle's prime mover, the Christian God, Descartes' thinking substance. Heidegger's response is not demolition, but archaeological retrieval. His famous Destruction carefully dismantles accumulated interpretations to uncover buried foundations. This involves what he calls retrieving, Wiederholung, authentic possibilities from the tradition, by showing how each epoch's genuine insights became hardened into dogma that concealed rather than revealed being. The destruction reveals the ontological difference, the crucial distinction between beings, what is, and being, that anything is at all, that has been systematically overlooked since the pre-Socratics. This concealment reaches its culmination in modern technological thinking, where being disappears entirely behind the calculative manipulation of beings as resources for human projects. As Heidegger observes, the essence of technology is nothing technological, but rather a specific way of revealing that makes everything appear as standing reserve, available for optimization and control. Under this regime, even human existence becomes another resource to be managed and enhanced. The destructive retrieval of the question of being thus becomes not merely philosophically urgent, but essential for authentic human existence. If we remain trapped within the metaphysical tradition's forgetfulness, we lose touch with the fundamental mystery that anything exists at all. Only by working through this tradition's concealment can we hope to recover what the early Greeks glimpsed before philosophy hardened into metaphysics. The wonder that there is something rather than nothing, and the recognition that human existence itself might provide the unique pathway back to this most fundamental question. Philosophy begins with a distinction so fundamental that its very forgetting has shaped the entire trajectory of Western thought. Martin Heidegger calls this the ontological difference, the crucial distinction between beings and being itself. When we encounter a hammer, we can investigate its weight, material composition, and functional properties. This is ontic inquiry, the study of particular beings and their characteristics. But what makes the hammer show up as meaningful at all? What allows it to appear within our understanding as a tool ready for use points towards something more primordial, being itself, the condition that makes any encounter with beings possible. Heidegger formulates this relationship precisely. Being is always the being of a being, and accordingly, it can be accessed only by way of some being. Being is not another entity alongside hammers, trees, and numbers. It is the prior understanding, the opening, the light within which all beings can manifest themselves. Yet, traditional philosophy has consistently collapsed this distinction, treating being as if it were simply the most universal being or the highest entity in a hierarchy of existence. This conflation generates what Heidegger diagnoses as ontotheology, the metaphysical tradition's compulsive search for a supreme being to ground all other beings. Whether this ultimate entity is conceived as God, the absolute, pure consciousness, or the form of the good, philosophy repeatedly seeks some particular being, however exalted, to serve as the foundation for everything else. In doing so, it misses being entirely, reducing the condition for all appearing to just another item that appears. The consequences of this confusion extend far beyond academic philosophy. When being gets forgotten in favor of beings, thinking becomes calculative rather than meditative. Reality gets reduced to what can be measured, manipulated, and controlled. The world transforms into a collection of resources awaiting optimization rather than a mysterious happening that calls for thoughtful dwelling. Recognizing the ontological difference opens the space for what Heidegger calls fundamental ontology, not the study of particular beings, or even the most general properties that beings share, but the investigation into the meaning of being itself. This represents a radical departure from traditional metaphysics. Instead of asking, "What is the highest being?" or "What do all beings have in common?" fundamental ontology poses a more primordial question. What does it mean for anything to be at all? This question cannot be approached through abstract reasoning alone. It requires attention to the one being for whom being is always already a question. Human existence, or what Heidegger terms Dasein. Only through careful analysis of how being shows up within human existence can we begin to think being as such, rather than immediately converting it into another object of theoretical knowledge. The ontological difference reveals itself as fundamentally temporal. Being is not a static presence lurking behind beings like some metaphysical backdrop. Rather, being essentially occurs as what Heidegger later calls the event of appropriation. Ereignis, the dynamic happening of unconcealment that allows beings to emerge within time, whilst simultaneously withdrawing from complete comprehension. This temporal character of being means that human existence cannot be understood as a substantial entity with fixed properties. Instead, Dasein must be grasped as the temporal opening where being and time intersect, where the question of being becomes urgent and unavoidable. The ontological difference thus opens onto the existential analytics that will reveal human existence as fundamentally being in the world, thrown into possibilities it must choose whilst facing its own finitude. Husserl's revolutionary call to return to the things themselves became Heidegger's philosophical starting point, yet it also marked the beginning of his most radical departure from his teacher. Husserl had shattered the complacent assumptions of natural science and everyday thinking by showing how consciousness always encounters objects as already meaningful, already given within horizons of significance that consciousness itself helps constitute. This phenomenological breakthrough revealed that we never simply bump into raw facts, but always discover things as they show themselves to consciousness in their meaningful presence. But Heidegger glimpsed something more fundamental, lurking beneath Husserl's achievement. What if the most important thing we must return to is not any object of consciousness at all, but being's own way of showing itself? In his early lecture courses, Heidegger praised Husserl's methodological breakthrough, whilst noting that phenomenology must become the letting be of being's self-showing, rather than consciousness's intentional grasping of objects. Phenomenology is our way of access to what is to be the theme of ontology, he declared, transforming the entire phenomenological enterprise from an investigation of consciousness into an opening toward being itself. This transformation shifts phenomenology from an epistemological method concerned with how consciousness knows objects to an ontological openness concerned with how being reveals itself. Heidegger argued that Husserl's focus on consciousness, however sophisticated, still remained trapped within the subject-object distinction that conceals being. Even Husserl's transcendental reduction, which bracketed the natural attitude to reveal consciousness's constitutive role, still preserved the fundamental framework of a subject standing over against objects. This framework, Heidegger realized, prevents us from encountering the more primordial phenomenon. Our existence, as always, already open to being self-showing and self-concealing. The shift moves us from consciousness of something to understanding of being, where understanding is not a mental activity, but our fundamental way of existing. We don't first exist as subjects who then develop understanding. Rather, we exist as understanding, as beings whose very mode of existence involves being open to the being of beings. This understanding is not something we possess, but something we are, the clearing within which beings can show themselves as the beings they are. This transformation exposes the essentially hermeneutic dimension of all understanding. We never encounter raw facts, but always beings as understood within prior frameworks of meaning that we inherit and inhabit. Any interpretation which is to contribute understanding must already have understood what is to be interpreted, Heidegger observed, revealing what he called the hermeneutic circle. This circle is not a logical problem to solve, but the fundamental structure of human existence itself. The hermeneutic circle means we can only understand particular beings because we always already move within an understanding of being. When we encounter a hammer, we don't first perceive neutral sense data and then infer its function. We immediately understand it as equipment within a meaningful world of projects and purposes. This immediate understanding is possible only because we exist within a prior, largely implicit understanding of what it means for things to be ready to hand, present at hand, or existing in the mode of human being. This prior understanding is not a set of explicit beliefs we consciously hold, but the background understanding of being within which all particular understanding becomes possible. It remains mostly unthought and unthematized, yet it guides and enables every encounter with beings. Heidegger developed his method of formal indication to point toward these existential structures rather than defining them as objective properties. Philosophical concepts must indicate directions for understanding rather than capturing their objects definitively. The hermeneutic approach reveals that human existence itself has the character of interpretation. We don't simply exist and then occasionally interpret. Rather, we exist by taking a stand on our existence within inherited frameworks of meaning. We are always already interpreting ourselves, others, and the world within traditional ways of understanding that we receive from our historical situation. Part 2. Dasein as being in the world. Heidegger introduces the revolutionary term Dasein to replace every traditional conception of human nature that philosophy had inherited. Where centuries of thought had defined humans as rational animals, conscious subjects, or immortal souls temporarily housed in material bodies, Heidegger offers something entirely different. Dasein literally means being there, and this simple translation already signals a profound shift. We are not beings who happen to exist in space and time. We are beings whose very existence is constituted by our there-ness, our essential situatedness, in particular, historical, cultural, and temporal contexts. But Dasein's uniqueness goes deeper than spatial and temporal location. Heidegger defines Dasein as a being whose very being is an issue for it. This means we exist by constantly taking a stand on our existence rather than simply having fixed properties like stones or trees. A rock simply is what it is, following the laws of physics without question or concern. Dasein, however, exists by understanding its existence and projecting into possibilities. We are beings for whom our own being becomes a question, a concern, a responsibility. This ontological structure makes Dasein unique among all entities. Unlike every other being that simply exists according to its nature, Dasein exists by interpreting its existence and choosing who to become. We worry about our lives, wonder about our purpose, take responsibility for our choices, and project ourselves into future possibilities. This is not a psychological observation about human behavior. It is an ontological claim about the structure of human existence itself. Heidegger's insight reveals why Dasein provides the privileged pathway to understanding being in general, not because humans are superior to other beings, but because our existence essentially involves a relationship to being itself. We are the beings who can ask what it means for anything to be, who can wonder about existence, who can take a stand on our own being. Through analyzing the structures of this being, for whom being is a question, fundamental ontology can uncover the meaning of being itself. This approach differs radically from traditional philosophical anthropology. Instead of seeking to define human essence through reason, consciousness, or will, Heidegger shifts from what questions to how questions. Rather than asking, what is human nature? Fundamental ontology asks, how does human existence exist? This shift reveals existence as more fundamental than essence. We exist first, thrown into particular situations, and only then determine who we are through our choices, interpretations, and ways of being. The analytic of Dasein employs what Heidegger calls existential analytic, a method that reveals universal structures of human existence rather than empirical facts about particular humans. These structures, called existentials, are not properties we possess, but ways we exist. They form the ontological framework within which any particular human life unfolds, regardless of historical period or cultural context. This analysis serves the larger project of fundamental ontology by preparing the ground for understanding being itself. Through examining how Dasein exists, we discover that being in the world constitutes Dasein's fundamental structure. This discovery immediately raises new questions. What does world mean in this ontological sense? And how does our being in differ from the spatial containment of objects within containers? These questions demand exploration of worldhood and the specific ways Dasein inhabits and understands its world. Heidegger's most radical insight cuts through centuries of philosophical confusion with surgical precision. We are never isolated subjects trying to bridge a gap to an external world. Being in the world reveals itself as a unified, indivisible structure that makes any encounter with beings possible in the first place. Being in the world is a state of Dasein which is necessary a priori, Heidegger declares, establishing this structure as more fundamental than the subject-object distinction that has haunted modern philosophy since Descartes first imagined himself as a thinking thing confronting dubitable external reality. The traditional picture presents us with an impossible problem. How does an inner mental realm connect to an outer physical world? How do subjective representations correspond to objective things? Heidegger shows this entire framework rests on a false premise. We are always already involved with things and others in meaningful contexts before any theoretical stance emerges. The carpenter does not first exist as a subject who then encounters a hammer as an object. She dwells within a world of building projects where hammers show up as ready for particular tasks within familiar contexts of work and craft. But what does this "in" of being in the world actually mean? Heidegger insists it is not spatial containment, like water contained within a glass. The "in" points rather to our fundamental attunement and understanding that opens up the possibility for any encounter whatsoever. We dwell within language, not as objects within a container, but as beings whose very capacity to understand depends upon inhabiting linguistic possibilities that always exceed our explicit grasp. We live within cultural practices, not spatially, but by being familiar with, involved in, attuned to, the largely invisible background of shared meanings that make particular actions intelligible. This reveals Heidegger's revolutionary concept of world itself. World is not a collection of objects arranged in space, waiting to be observed by detached subjects. World is the meaningful totality within which beings can be encountered as something definite, as tools or obstacles, opportunities or threats, beautiful or ugly, significant or trivial. Heidegger draws a crucial distinction between world and mere environment. Animals inhabit environments of stimulus and response, reacting to features that trigger instinctual behaviors. Only Dasein has world as the open realm of significance, where beings can appear as something within contexts of care and possibility. World is not something we observe from the outside, but something we always already inhabit. It consists of the largely invisible background of cultural practices, linguistic possibilities, historical traditions, and shared concerns that provide the horizon within which particular beings can show up as meaningful. The world of the medieval craftsman differs fundamentally from the world of the modern scientist, Encation, not because they encounter different objects, but because different possibilities for understanding and engagement are opened up within their respective worlds. This analysis devastates modern epistemology's central obsession with the problem of knowledge. If we are always already being in the world, then the question is not how an isolated subject can achieve certain knowledge of external objects. The question becomes, how does our being in the world allow beings to show up in their various modes of being. The subject-object framework reveals itself as a derivative abstraction from our more primordial involvement with things and others in shared worlds of significance. Heidegger's critique strikes at the heart of the Cartesian tradition that has dominated modern thought. The problem of bridging subject and object only arises when we artificially abstract ourselves from the concrete contexts of engaged activity where we always already find ourselves. The theoretical stance that treats things as mere objects present at hand emerges from and depends upon our more fundamental, practical engagement with things as equipment, ready for use within familiar projects and concerns. This points toward a complete transformation in how we understand our primary relationship to things. Rather than beginning with theoretical observation of neutral objects, we must recognize that practical engagement reveals the more fundamental way beings show up within our concerned involvement. When Heidegger turns to examine how we actually encounter things in our everyday existence, he begins with something as simple as a hammer. This choice is far from arbitrary. The hammer reveals something profound about the fundamental structure of human being in the world that centuries of philosophical tradition have overlooked. When we skillfully use a hammer, something remarkable happens. The hammer itself withdraws from our explicit attention. We do not focus on the hammer as an object, but see through it to the work being accomplished. As Heidegger puts it, the less we just stare at the hammer thing, and the more we seize hold of it and use it, the more primordial does our relationship to it become. This transparency of equipment in skillful use reveals what Heidegger calls the ready-to-hand mode of being. The hammer becomes an extension of our bodily engagement with the world, so seamlessly integrated into our activity that it disappears from conscious awareness. We are absorbed in the hammering, in the building, in the project at hand. The hammer is not primarily an object we observe, but equipment we employ. This readiness to hand constitutes our most basic way of encountering things, more fundamental than any theoretical observation or scientific analysis. But equipment never stands alone. The hammer refers beyond itself to nails, to boards, to the house being built, to the family who will live there, to the cultural practices of dwelling that give meaning to the entire enterprise. Heidegger maps these connections through what he calls in order to structures. We hammer in order to join boards, in order to build walls, in order to create shelter, in order to enable a particular way of life. Each piece of equipment derives its meaning from its place in this referential totality, this network of practical involvements that ultimately connects to fundamental ways of being human. The hammer is never just a physical object with certain properties. It is a node in a web of cultural practices, human projects, and meaningful possibilities. When we understand the hammer as equipment, we understand it in terms of its role in human dwelling, in the care and concern that structure our existence. The referential totality of equipment thus reveals the essentially social and historical character of human existence. We are always already embedded in inherited practices and shared projects that give our individual activities their sense and direction. This analysis gains its full significance when we consider what happens when equipment breaks down. The hammer becomes conspicuous as an object only when it breaks, proves too heavy for the task, or goes missing. In these moments of breakdown, what Heidegger calls conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy announce themselves. The broken hammer suddenly appears as a mere thing with properties, weight, and material composition. Our smooth practical involvement is disrupted, and we shift into a theoretical attitude, examining the hammer as a present-at-hand object. These moments of breakdown are philosophically crucial because they reveal both the normal transparency of functioning equipment and the derivative character of theoretical observation. The scientific attitude that treats things as objects with measurable properties emerges primarily when our practical involvement fails. The theoretical stance is not our most basic way of encountering the world, but a founded mode that depends upon the more primordial practical engagement that usually remains hidden. This insight transforms our understanding of knowledge, truth, and human existence itself. We are not primarily detached observers contemplating a world of objects, but agents engaged in projects, absorbed in practical involvements that reveal the world as a meaningful totality of equipment and possibilities. The ready-to-hand structure shows that practical engagement is ontologically more fundamental than theoretical knowledge. Truth is not primarily the correspondence between propositions and facts, but the disclosure of the world through our skillful involvement with equipment. This practical engagement also reveals the essentially temporal structure of human existence. When we use equipment, we are always pressing forward into possibilities, working toward projects that matter to us. The hammer points beyond itself to the house to be built, to the future dwelling it will help create. Part 3. The structure of care. Heidegger reveals human existence as structured by two fundamental and seemingly contradictory characteristics that shape every moment of our being in the world. We discover ourselves thrown into existence without our choosing. Yet, we exist essentially by projecting forward into possibilities we must select. This apparent paradox between constraint and freedom opens the deepest questions about what it means to be human. Thrownness, Geworfenheit, names our recognition that we find ourselves always already situated in existence, without having chosen our basic circumstances. We inherit a historical moment we didn't select, speak a native language we didn't design, grow up within cultural possibilities we didn't create, and face fundamental life questions we didn't ask to confront. As Heidegger observes, Dasein has been thrown into existence, and this thrownness reveals itself in Dasein's state of mind. We discover our thrownness not through abstract reflection, but through moods that disclose our fundamental situatedness, an anxiety that reveals the weight of existence we didn't choose to bear, the homesickness that shows our dependence on familiar worlds, the boredom that exposes our need for meaningful engagement with inherited possibilities. Yet we exist equally, essentially through projection. Entwerf, our basic temporal structure of existing ahead of ourselves, always understanding ourselves in terms of what we might become, rather than what we currently are. Heidegger insists that Dasein is thrown possibility through and through, and projection is the existential structure of the space of maneuver, of factical ability to be. Projection transcends mere planning or goal setting. It names our fundamental way of being temporally oriented toward future possibilities that give meaning to present activities. We understand ourselves by projecting into roles we might inhabit, relationships we might develop, projects we might complete, always already engaged with possibilities that structure how current situations matter to us. This creates an apparent paradox at the heart of human existence. How can we be simultaneously thrown into circumstances beyond our control and free to project into self-chosen possibilities? The tension appears everywhere in concrete existence. We inherit cultural traditions we didn't create, but must choose how to appropriate them. We find ourselves in historical circumstances that constrain our options, but must decide how to respond within those constraints. We speak languages whose meanings we didn't establish, but must use them to express our own understanding. Heidegger dissolves this apparent contradiction by revealing thrownness and projection as unified aspects of our temporal existence. We are free precisely within and through our constraints. Authentic projection emerges by owning up to, rather than denying our thrownness, by taking responsibility for inherited possibilities, rather than pretending we create meaning from nothing. As Heidegger puts it, thrownness is such that factically Dasein can, in its existing, choose itself and win itself. It can also lose itself and never win itself, or only seem to do so. The unified structure Heidegger calls throne projection reveals finite freedom as more primordial than either determinism or absolute liberty. We are neither completely constrained by circumstances nor absolutely free to create meaning from nothing. Instead, authentic existence emerges through the resolute appropriation of inherited possibilities for future action, taking over what we've been given and projecting it forward through choices that express our own most understanding of what matters. This analysis points toward the third structural element of care, our tendency to flee from the responsibility of throne projection into the anonymous conformity of everyday existence, where we let others decide what possibilities matter and how we should understand ourselves. When Heidegger introduces the concept of fallenness, he makes a crucial clarification that transforms how we understand our everyday existence. Fallenness does not express any negative evaluation, he writes, but is used to signify that Dasein is proximally, and for the most part, alongside the world of its concern. This is not a moral condemnation, but a structural analysis of how we necessarily begin our existence by absorbing the ready-made interpretations, values, and possibilities provided by our cultural context. We are thrown into a world already filled with meanings, and we naturally take up these inherited ways of understanding ourselves and our possibilities. The anonymous public realm that Heidegger calls the they provides default answers to the most fundamental existential questions. What counts as success? How we should spend our time? What we ought to value? How we should understand ourselves and others? This is not some external force imposing itself upon us, but the very medium through which we first encounter meaning and possibility. The they self operates through what Heidegger identifies as three interconnected mechanisms: averageness, leveling down, and publicness. Averageness reduces all possibilities to common denominators that anyone can adopt without personal commitment or genuine engagement. What emerges as normal or acceptable represents not the highest possibilities of human existence, but rather what can be safely embraced by everyone without risk or authentic choice is less than #0. 5# is greater than leveling down, ensures that distinctive possibilities are flattened into manageable generalities, whilst publicness makes everything available to everyone in ways that obscure the need for individual appropriation and personal commitment. This structure manifests in three characteristic modes of fallen existence that Heidegger analyses with remarkable precision. Idle talk passes along interpretations without genuine understanding, creating the illusion that we comprehend our world whilst actually concealing it. Idle talk is the possibility of understanding everything without previously making the thing one's own, Heidegger observes. We repeat phrases, adopt opinions, and express views that we have never genuinely examined or personally appropriated. Curiosity seeks constant novelty without depth. jumping from one thing to another in a restless pursuit of the new that never allows genuine engagement with anything. This is not the wonder that drives authentic questioning, but rather a superficial fascination that flees from the anxiety of sustained encounter with existence. Ambiguity obscures the distinction between authentic and inauthentic understanding, making it impossible to tell whether our comprehension emerges from genuine engagement or mere repetition of public interpretations. These modes of fallenness create what appears to be understanding, whilst actually concealing both ourselves and the world. We feel informed, engaged, and comprehending. Yet this very feeling prevents us from recognizing how thoroughly we remain trapped within inherited interpretations that we have never made our own. The danger of fallenness lies not in its initial necessity, but in its tendency toward perpetual self-reinforcement. This falling being in the world has a kind of motion, Heidegger writes, which, in accordance with its own kind of being, we call the downward plunge. We systematically flee from the anxiety that would reveal our need to choose our existence authentically, seeking instead the comfortable anonymity of conformity with what one does, thinks, and values. Yet this very analysis points toward the possibility of authentic existence. The they-self that conceals our authentic possibilities also makes possible the recognition of our fallenness, and through this recognition, the call of conscience that can summon us back to authentic engagement with our existence. Heidegger's analysis reaches its culmination in the concept of care, not Sorge, which unifies the scattered existential structures we have examined into a single, fundamental way of being. Care is not a psychological attitude or emotional disposition, but the ontological foundation of Dasein's existence itself. Heidegger provides a formal definition that captures this complexity. The being of Dasein means ahead of itself, being already in the world, as being alongside entities encountered within the world. This intricate formulation reveals how human existence unfolds across three temporal dimensions simultaneously. We are futural beings who project ahead of ourselves, whilst already thrown into a world we never chose and constantly engaged alongside the entities we encounter in our everyday concerns. The phrase, being ahead of oneself, illuminates the essentially futural character of human existence. We do not exist primarily as present-at-hand objects with fixed properties, but as beings whose very identity emerges from our projection into possibilities. When we understand ourselves as students, we exist primarily in terms of future achievements and qualifications, rather than present knowledge. When we identify as parents, we project into possibilities of nurturing and guidance that give meaning to current activities. This temporal structure reveals that Dasein is essentially incomplete, for we exist as possibilities rather than actualities, always pressing forward into projects that define who we are becoming rather than who we currently are. This futural orientation does not exist in isolation, but emerges from our thrown condition and fallen engagement with the world. Care unifies thrownness, projection, and fallenness without eliminating their essential tension. We care about our existence precisely because we find ourselves thrown into it without choice, projecting into possibilities we cannot fully control, whilst constantly tempted to lose ourselves in the anonymous conformity of everyday life. As Heidegger emphasizes, care does not result from a combination of these structures, but is rather the primordial structural totality within which they emerge as interconnected aspects of a single phenomenon. This unified structure of care reveals the essential restlessness of human existence. We cannot simply be in the manner of stones or trees, but must constantly take a stand on our being, projecting into possibilities that matter to us, whilst grounded in circumstances we did not choose. Care discloses why human existence involves such fundamental anxiety. For we are responsible for an existence we never requested, committed to possibilities we cannot guarantee, engaged in a world that constantly threatens to absorb us into its anonymous routines. Care serves as the ontological foundation that makes all particular concerns possible. We can care about specific people, projects, or values only because our existence has the fundamental structure of care itself. Heidegger distinguishes between ontological care, the basic structure of existence, and ontic concerns, the particular things we happen to care about. This distinction reveals how care operates as the transcendental condition that enables specific involvements whilst remaining more fundamental than any of them. The temporal structure of care points beyond individual existence toward the recognition that we exist essentially with others. Our projection into possibilities, our thrown circumstances, and our fallen absorption in everyday activities all occur within shared worlds of meaning that we inherit from others and pass along to future generations. Care, thus, prepares the ground for understanding how being with constitutes another fundamental structure of Dasein's existence. Heidegger reveals that being with others is not something we add to an already complete existence, like joining a club or entering a relationship. Rather, Dasein constitutes the fundamental structure of Dasein itself. We are essentially social beings whose very existence is constituted through relationships with others. As Heidegger declares, being with is an existential constituent of being in the world, and remarkably, even Dasein's being alone is being within the world. Even in our most solitary moments, we exist within linguistic and cultural possibilities that are essentially shared. The thoughts we think, the projects we pursue, the very categories through which we understand ourselves, derive their meaning from communal contexts that precede and exceed our individual existence. This insight transforms our understanding of solitude itself. When we retreat to be alone, we do not escape the social dimension of existence, but rather inhabit it differently. The language in which we conduct our inner dialogue, cultural frameworks through which we interpret our experience, the very notion of selfhood we employ, all emerge from and remain grounded in shared human existence. Our most private reflections occur within horizons of meaning that are irreducibly communal. Heidegger emphasizes that others are not objects we encounter in the world, but co-Dasein who share our basic structure of existence as beings for whom being is a question. He distinguishes sharply between others as fellow human beings and the other as objects of theoretical study. We do not primarily encounter others by observing their behavior and inferring their mental states, as traditional philosophy suggests. Instead, we engage with them directly in shared projects and concerns where their existence as caring, projecting, thrown beings becomes immediately evident. Consider how we encounter others in everyday situations. When we work alongside a colleague on a project, we do not first observe their physical movements and then deduce their intentions. Rather, we immediately recognize them as someone engaged in meaningful activity, someone who understands the significance of the task, someone who shares our concern for its completion. Their existence as Dasein, as a being who projects possibilities, who is thrown into circumstances, who cares about outcomes, is directly present in our encounter. This recognition extends to Heidegger's analysis of the modes of being with others, which range from fallen conformity to authentic community. He introduces the concept of solicitude, Fourfold, as care directed toward others, but this care manifests in fundamentally different ways. Leaping in represents a mode of solicitude that dominates and substitutes for others, taking over their concerns and reducing them to objects of our management. This seemingly helpful approach actually diminishes others by denying them the opportunity to engage authentically with their own existence. In contrast, leaping ahead represents authentic solicitude that liberates others for their own most possibilities. Rather than solving their problems or making their decisions, this mode of care helps others confront their own existence more authentically. It involves recognizing their fundamental freedom and responsibility, whilst providing support for their journey toward authentic selfhood. Authentic being with thus requires letting others be in their authentic existence, rather than reducing them to they categories or treating them as objects of manipulation. Authentic community emerges not through shared beliefs or common interests, but through mutual recognition of finitude and the shared call to authentic existence. Heidegger's later concept of authentic historicity reveals how individuals can share historical destiny whilst maintaining individual resoluteness. This communal dimension transcends mere agreement or cooperation, involving instead a deeper recognition of our shared condition as finite beings called to authentic existence. This analysis reveals that authentic existence is not solipsistic self-realization, but necessarily involves freeing both ourselves and others for genuine possibilities. The path to authenticity requires breaking free from the they-self, but this liberation opens us to more authentic relationships with others who are similarly called to confront their own most existence. Part 4. Anxiety and the Call of Conscience. Fear always has a determinate object. We fear specific threats that loom before us. Illness, failure, rejection, death. Each fear points towards something particular in the world that endangers our projects or well-being. But anxiety operates differently. Anxiety has no particular object, no specific threat we can identify and address. Instead, as Heidegger reveals, that in the face of which one has anxiety is being in the world as such. Anxiety confronts us not with any particular danger, but with the strangeness of existence itself. This distinction proves crucial for understanding how anxiety functions as what Heidegger calls a fundamental attunement. Unlike fear, which drives us towards specific defensive responses, anxiety leaves us suspended without clear direction. The familiar world of everyday concerns suddenly becomes uncanny, foreign, no longer offering the comfortable certainties that usually guide our choices. The reliable interpretations provided by the they-self lose their grip, and we find ourselves confronting the raw fact of our existence without the cushioning of social conventions. Heidegger captures this experience with his analysis of uncanniness, Unheimlichkeit, which literally means not at home-ness. In anxiety, we feel displaced from the familiar world we thought we knew. The social roles, cultural meanings, and shared interpretations that normally make existence feel secure and comprehensible suddenly appear arbitrary, unable to provide the foundation we assumed they offered. This uncanniness reveals something essential about our condition that everyday conformity typically conceals. What anxiety discloses is the ultimate groundlessness of our existence and the responsibility we cannot escape. We discover ourselves thrown into a world we didn't choose, compelled to project into possibilities we cannot fully control, always threatened by the tendency to lose ourselves in fallen conformity. The comfortable securities of the they-self prove illusory When anxiety strips them away, we realize that no external authority, no social convention, no inherited tradition can relieve us of the burden of choosing who to become. This recognition proves profoundly individualizing. Whilst the they-self provides anonymous comfort through shared interpretations and collective meanings, anxiety isolates us by revealing that ultimately, each person must take responsibility for their own existence. As Heidegger observes, anxiety individualizes Dasein and thus discloses it as solus ipse. This isolation differs fundamentally from loneliness. Loneliness seeks connection with others to fill an emotional void. The individualization that anxiety brings involves recognizing that authentic existence cannot be achieved through conformity, that we must each confront our own thrownness, mortality, and responsibility. Yet this individualizing function serves a crucial purpose. Anxiety breaks the spell of fallen conformity and creates the opening for authentic existence. When the familiar interpretations of the they-self lose their hold, we become available to hear what Heidegger calls the call of conscience. This call summons us away from the anonymous comfort of conformity toward the anxiety of taking responsibility for our existence. Anxiety brings Dasein face to face with its world as world, and thus brings it face to face with itself as being in the world. The discomfort of anxiety thus proves essential rather than merely troublesome. Most people flee from anxiety, back into the reassuring interpretations of the prize self, seeking to restore the familiar sense that existence has predetermined meaning and direction. But anxiety reveals the freedom that makes authentic existence possible. Only when we recognize the groundlessness of inherited interpretations can we take responsibility for creating meaning through our choices. Only when we feel the weight of our thrown projection can we choose authentically rather than simply following the crowd. Anxiety, therefore, functions as the fundamental attunement that opens the possibility of authentic existence. It reveals both our freedom and the groundlessness that makes choice both necessary and significant. Without anxiety's disclosure of uncanniness, we would remain trapped in the comfortable illusion that existence has predetermined meaning, that conformity provides genuine security, that we can avoid the responsibility of choosing who to become. The call of conscience emerges as perhaps the most profound phenomenon in Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence. This is not the voice of social morality or religious commandment, but something far more fundamental, the call that summons Dasein back from its comfortable lostness in the anonymous they-self to confront its ownmost possibilities. As Heidegger puts it, the call of conscience has the character of an appeal to Dasein by calling it to its ownmost potentiality for being itself. This call breaks through the chatter and busyness of everyday existence with a silent authority that cannot be ignored, even when we desperately want to avoid its summons. What makes this call so unsettling is its paradoxical structure. It comes from within us, yet appears completely alien to our everyday self-understanding. We recognize it as our own voice, yet it feels foreign because we have become so thoroughly absorbed in the comfortable anonymity of public existence. The call speaks, but without words. It commands, but gives no specific instructions. It summons us to action, but provides no ready-made program to follow. Heidegger captures this paradox perfectly. The caller is Dasein in its uncanniness, and the call does not give any information about worldly events. It calls Dasein's self from its lostness in the they. This apparent emptiness of content is not a deficiency, but the very essence of the call's authenticity. Conscience cannot provide us with predetermined answers, precisely because authentic existence requires each person to take full responsibility for their own choices. The they-self constantly seeks external authorities to relieve it of this burden, looking for rules, traditions, or expert opinions that will tell it what to do. But the call of conscience strips away these comfortable supports, revealing that ultimately we must choose without ultimate justification, decide without guarantees, act without the security of predetermined correctness. What the call reveals is our fundamental guilt, though this is not guilt in any moral sense. Heidegger's notion of Schuld points to something more basic: the structure of being responsible for our thrown existence without having chosen the conditions of that responsibility. Being guilty does not result from an indebtedness, he argues, but that indebtedness becomes possible only on the basis of a primordial being guilty. We find ourselves already thrown into a world we did not choose, with possibilities we did not select, facing a future we cannot fully control. Yet, we remain responsible for what we make of this thrown situation. This guilt reveals the groundlessness of existence itself. We must choose our path through life without any ultimate foundation for our choices. We must take responsibility for decisions made within circumstances we did not create. We must project ourselves toward possibilities, whilst knowing that our time is finite and our understanding limited. The call of conscience makes this groundlessness impossible to ignore, calling us back from the reassuring illusions of the they-self to face the anxiety-provoking reality of our finite freedom. But this revelation is not merely destructive. The call of conscience prepares the ground for authentic resoluteness by showing us both our thrownness and our freedom within that thrownness. As Heidegger explains, the call calls back Dasein's falling into the they and simultaneously calls forth to the potentiality for being. It reveals that whilst we cannot escape our thrown condition, we retain the power to choose how we relate to that condition. We can continue fleeing into the comfortable anonymity of public existence, or we can embrace the responsibility that is authentically ours. The call thus opens the possibility of resoluteness as Dasein's authentic response to its finite, guilty existence. This is not the resoluteness of the fanatic who claims absolute certainty, but the resoluteness of someone who acts decisively whilst fully acknowledging the groundlessness of their situation. It is the courage to choose and act without ultimate guarantees, to take responsibility for a thrown existence we never chose, to project ourselves authentically toward death, whilst knowing that all our projects remain finite and vulnerable. Resoluteness stands as Heidegger's answer to the fundamental question of how we might respond authentically to anxiety's call of conscience. This is not resoluteness as mere determination or stubborn willfulness, but what Heidegger terms Entschlossenheit, a distinctive mode of being open to our existence that takes full responsibility for our thrown condition whilst projecting authentically into chosen possibilities. Resoluteness is a distinctive mode of Dasein's disclosedness, Heidegger writes. It is the mode which is most primordial and which is authentic. Here we encounter not a particular decision or course of action, but rather the fundamental stance from which authentic decisions emerge, a clear-sighted acceptance of our finite situation, combined with decisive commitment to possibilities we genuinely own. The structure of resolute existence reveals itself most clearly when contrasted with its alternatives. Unlike impulsive action, which leaps toward possibilities without genuine ownership, resoluteness involves what Heidegger calls being open, Erschlossenheit, to our situation in its full complexity. We acknowledge our thrownness, the inherited cultural and historical circumstances that shape our possibilities, while simultaneously taking responsibility for how we project into those possibilities. Unlike endless deliberation, which perpetually defers commitment in the illusion of finding perfect certainty, Resoluteness acts from within, acknowledged uncertainty. Resoluteness does not withdraw itself from actuality, Heidegger observes, but discovers first what is factically possible. This means working with, rather than against our finite condition, finding genuine possibilities within our inherited situation, rather than seeking impossible escape from the constraints of human existence. The authentic individual does not achieve resoluteness through isolation from others, but through what Heidegger calls authentic being with others. This involves recognizing that others too face the call to authentic existence, and supporting, rather than undermining their response to that call. Authentic community emerges when individuals support each other's authentic existence, rather than reinforcing fallen conformity to their interpretations. Heidegger speaks of resoluteness which is authentic and whole, as involving being with others in the mode of solicitude, which leaps ahead and liberates. This liberating solicitude helps others toward their own authentic possibilities, rather than imposing predetermined roles or expectations upon them. Yet resoluteness cannot be achieved once and maintained permanently. The tendency toward fallenness remains structural and constant throughout human existence. We never graduate from the possibility of losing ourselves in their interpretations. Never reach a point where authenticity becomes automatic or effortless. Resoluteness must be constantly renewed, repeatedly chosen in the face of ongoing pressure to conform to public interpretations and flee from the anxiety of authentic existence. Resoluteness, as authentic being oneself, Heidegger emphasizes, does not detach Dasein from its world, nor does it isolate it so that it becomes a free-floating one. Rather, it grounds us more deeply in our worldly engagement, whilst maintaining the authentic stance that owns up to the responsibility of existence. This analysis points toward a deeper question. What gives ultimate urgency and significance to the choice between authentic and inauthentic existence? If both remain permanent possibilities throughout life, what motivates the difficult work of authenticity rather than the comfortable drift of everyday conformity? Heidegger's answer lies in confronting the most fundamental aspect of human finitude, our essential being toward death, which gives authentic existence its ultimate meaning and urgency. Part 5. Being toward death and finitude. Death stands as Dasein's most fundamental possibility, distinguished from every other possibility by characteristics that reveal the very structure of authentic existence. Heidegger identifies death as uniquely ownmost. It cannot be shared, transferred, or experienced by proxy. No one can die my death for me. No collective experience can substitute for this most singular confrontation with finitude. Death is equally non-relational, in that it isolates Dasein from the comfort of others' experiences and the security of shared understanding. When facing death authentically, we stand utterly alone before our finite existence. This possibility is also absolutely inevitable, regardless of how we live or what we achieve. Yet paradoxically, death remains indefinite in its timing. We know with absolute certainty that death will come, but this certainty exists alongside complete uncertainty about when. Heidegger captures this tension precisely. Death is a possibility of being, which Dasein itself has to take over in every case. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its ownmost potentiality for being. Death differs fundamentally from all other possibilities because it represents the possibility that ends all possibilities, but the horizon that gives all choices their urgency and significance. The they-self systematically evades this confrontation with mortality through idle talk that transforms death from my own most possibility into a general fact about human existence. When we say, one dies, death comes to everyone, or we all have to go sometime, we employ anonymous formulations that conceal death's individualizing power. These phrases treat death as something that happens to people in general, a distant statistical reality, rather than the fundamental possibility that shapes every moment of my existence. The they-self thus neutralizes death's authenticating force by dissolving it into public discourse, where it becomes merely another topic of conversation rather than the ultimate call to authentic existence. This evasion extends into what Heidegger terms being toward the end, approaches that focus on dying as a biological process rather than death as an existential possibility. Medical science studies the mechanisms of dying. Legal systems define death through measurable criteria. Social institutions manage death through rituals and procedures. Whilst these approaches serve practical purposes, they fundamentally misunderstand death's philosophical significance. Heidegger draws a crucial distinction. Ending does not mean finishedness. Ending means finitude. Death is not simply the termination of biological functions, but the fundamental structure that reveals existence as finite and therefore meaningful. Death exists as possibility rather than actuality throughout our lives. We never experience our own death, but live always in relationship to it as the ultimate horizon. Heidegger observes that, as long as Dasein is, it has never reached its wholeness, precisely because death is not an experience we undergo, but the limit that gives meaning to all experience. This reveals why authentic being toward death cannot involve morbid fascination with dying, but rather what Heidegger calls anticipatory resoluteness, embracing finitude as the condition that makes authentic choice possible. Only by acknowledging that our time is limited do our decisions acquire genuine weight and our projects authentic urgency. Death, as the possibility that illuminates all other possibilities, transforms our understanding of temporality itself and opens the path toward authentic existence. Death is not an event awaiting us in some distant future, but the ever-present horizon that gives shape and urgency to every possibility we face. Heidegger's profound insight reveals that our mortality is not something we will eventually experience, but rather the fundamental limit that makes all experience meaningful and pressing. Anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they-self, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself. This anticipatory awareness of our finitude transforms existence from a casual drift through endless possibilities into a focused engagement with the choices that truly matter. When we live with constant recognition that our time is limited and our opportunities finite, each decision carries weight precisely because it cannot be endlessly deferred or reversed. This recognition fundamentally transforms how we understand choice and commitment. Rather than seeking infinite options or permanent security, we embrace the productive urgency that emerges from knowing our possibilities are bounded by mortality. Heidegger reveals how anticipation discloses to existence that its uttermost possibility lies in giving itself up, and thus it shatters all one's tenaciousness to whatever existence one has reached. This shattering proves liberating rather than despairing, because it frees us from false attachments to permanent security and endless accumulation. Anticipatory resoluteness teaches us that authentic commitment emerges not from having unlimited time to decide, but from recognizing that our time for realizing meaningful possibilities is inherently limited. The confrontation with finitude reveals the groundlessness of all they interpretations. and anonymous public answers. When faced with our ultimate aloneness in death, the comfortable certainties provided by social conformity lose their authority, compelling us to take genuine responsibility for our existence. Being towards death is essentially anxiety because it reveals the possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. This anxiety individualizes us, not through selfish withdrawal, but through recognition that authentic existence cannot be achieved through conformity to external standards. The anticipation of death strips away the illusion that others can live our lives for us, or that collective opinion can substitute for personal responsibility. This responsibility culminates in authentic historicity, where anticipatory resoluteness connects us to our inherited cultural possibilities through creative appropriation rather than passive conformity. Heidegger's concept of retrieval shows how we choose our heritage in light of our finite future, creating genuine continuity between past, present, and future. Anticipatory resoluteness transforms both individual existence and historical understanding by revealing finitude as the essential structure that makes meaningful existence possible, rather than a limitation to be overcome. Through this recognition, we discover that mortality is not the enemy of authentic living, but its necessary condition, the source of both urgency and meaning in human existence. Finitude reveals itself as the most primordial structure of subjectivity, yet our immediate response is to experience it as limitation. We encounter death as the ultimate boundary, time as relentless constraint, thrownness as unwelcome restriction upon our freedom. Heidegger's radical insight transforms this entire perspective. Far from being obstacles to meaningful existence, these finite conditions make significance possible at all. Without death pressing upon every moment, no choice would carry weight. Without temporal limits forcing selection among possibilities, every option could eventually be realized, rendering decision trivial. The very constraints we resist create the urgency that transforms mere preference into existential commitment. An infinite being faces no genuine choices, because unlimited time allows the exploration of every possibility. Each path becomes equally arbitrary when all paths remain perpetually available. But finite existence forces selection, and in that forced choosing, meaning emerges. When Heidegger declares that finitude reveals itself as the most primordial structure of subjectivity, he illuminates how limitation generates, rather than destroys, freedom. The boundaries of mortality and temporality don't imprison us within a smaller space of possibility. They create the very structure within which possibility becomes meaningful. Authentic existence embraces rather than denies this finite condition. Heidegger's analysis reveals that authentic existence is not something which floats above falling everydayness. Existentially, it is only a modified way in which such everydayness is seized upon. Authenticity doesn't escape the human condition, but transforms our relationship to thrownness, mortality, and fallenness. By owning rather than fleeing these structural features of existence, the authentic individual doesn't transcend finitude, but discovers freedom within limitation, by accepting responsibility for choices made under constraint. This acceptance creates a profound shift in how we relate to others. When we recognize our shared mortality and thrownness, competitive self-assertion loses its desperate edge. Anonymous conformity no longer provides refuge from existential responsibility. Instead, common finitude becomes the basis for authentic community. Heidegger's concept of authentic being with one another reveals how this recognition makes possible the right kind of objectivity, which frees the other in his freedom for himself. Shared acknowledgement of mortality creates solidarity based on mutual support for authentic existence, rather than collective evasion of existential demands. This finite freedom grounds authentic historical existence, where communities take responsibility for inherited cultural possibilities while projecting into chosen futures. Heidegger's later analysis of historical Dasein shows how we exist in the mode of a generation, sharing common destiny whilst maintaining individual resoluteness. Historical existence doesn't mean passive acceptance of tradition nor revolutionary rejection of the past, but thoughtful appropriation of inherited possibilities in light of finite future projects. Temporality emerges as the fundamental structure, unifying individual authenticity, communal solidarity, and historical responsibility, past thrownness, present decision, and future projection interweave in every moment of authentic existence. The recognition of finitude doesn't diminish human possibility, but reveals the temporal structure that makes all possibility meaningful. This temporal analysis points toward deeper questions about how primordial time grounds both personal existence and historical understanding, demanding exploration of how being itself unfolds through temporal structures that finite beings like ourselves can only partially comprehend. Part 6. Temporality and Historicity. Our ordinary conception of time betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of human existence itself. We imagine time, as Heidegger puts it, a sequence of nowses which are constantly present at hand, simultaneously passing away and coming along. This linear model, past flowing into present, flowing into future, seems so natural that we rarely question it. Yet this understanding completely misses what Heidegger calls primordial temporality, the authentic temporal structure that makes human existence possible. The traditional view treats time like a river flowing in one direction, carrying us from what was through what is toward what will be. We exist, supposedly, in the present moment, with the past behind us as completed history and the future ahead as not yet real possibility. This mechanical conception reduces temporality to a series of discrete now points, each replacing the previous one in endless succession. But this misses entirely how we actually exist as human beings. Dasein does not primarily exist in the present. We exist by projecting ourselves into our possibilities. When you understand yourself as a student, you are not describing a present property like having brown hair or being 6 feet tall. You are projecting yourself toward a future graduation, toward becoming educated, toward possibilities that do not yet exist, but which give meaning to your current activities. The student stays up late studying, not because of what they presently are, but because of what they are becoming. This reveals why Heidegger insists that the primary phenomenon of primordial and authentic temporality is the future. We exist primarily futurally. Dasein comes towards itself futurally in its own most potentiality for being. This is not merely about making plans or having goals. It is about the fundamental structure of human existence itself. We understand ourselves in terms of our possibilities, and the most fundamental possibility is our own death. It's the possibility that ends all other possibilities. Death is not simply an event that will happen later. It is the ultimate horizon that gives urgency and meaning to all our choices now. Because we are finite beings moving toward death, every choice matters. Every possibility we pursue means other possibilities we must abandon. This finitude transforms the future from an abstract realm of endless options into the concrete structure of our existence. But this future projection is only possible because we are always already thrown into a world we did not choose. inheriting possibilities we did not create. Heidegger calls this dimension having been, Gewissenheit, not the dead past of completed events, but the living heritage that continues to shape what futures are available to us. Having been arises from the future, and in such a way that the future, which has been, releases from itself the present. You cannot project yourself toward just any possibility. A medieval peasant could not authentically project toward becoming a software engineer, not merely because the technology did not exist, but because that possibility was not part of their inherited world of meaning. Our thrownness provides both the resources and the constraints for authentic projection. The language we speak, culture we inherit, the historical moment we occupy, all of this having been, opens certain possibilities, whilst closing others. This creates a dynamic relationship between future and past that generates the authentic present. The present is not a static now moment, but what Heidegger calls the moment of vision, Augenblick, the dynamic tension where resolute choice appropriates inherited possibilities for authentic future action. The moment of vision is nothing other than the look of resolute disclosedness in which the full situation of action opens itself and keeps itself open. In the moment of vision, past and future converge in decisive action. The student who chooses to continue their studies despite difficulties is not simply following a plan made earlier. They are reappropriating their inherited educational possibilities in light of their authentic future projection, creating a present moment charged with temporal depth. The present becomes the site where having been and future possibility meet in resolute choice. This unified temporal structure, future projection grounded in inherited having been, generating authentic present action, and many. We exist as historical beings, not in the sense that we happen to live in historical time, but because our very mode of being is constituted by our relationship to inherited cultural possibilities. Heidegger reveals that historicity is the state of being that is constitutive for Dasein's happening as such. Only on the basis of such happening is anything like world history possible. This fundamental insight transforms our understanding of what it means to be human. We are not isolated individuals who subsequently encounter history, but beings whose existence is essentially structured by our inheritance of cultural possibilities that we must choose how to appropriate. Historicity, or Geschichtlichkeit, differs radically from mere knowledge about past events or abstract historical consciousness. It names our way of existing as inheritors who must actively engage with the cultural heritage that shapes our possibilities for understanding and action. We find ourselves always already thrown into interpretations, practices, and possibilities that we did not create, but which constitute the horizon within which we can project ourselves toward future possibilities. This thrownness is not a limitation, but the very condition that makes meaningful existence possible. The authentic appropriation of this historical inheritance occurs through what Heidegger calls retrieval. This is not mere repetition or nostalgic return to the past, but creative appropriation of inherited possibilities for present action that transforms both our understanding of the past and our projection into the future. The resoluteness in which Dasein comes back to itself discloses current factical possibilities of authentic existing and discloses them in terms of the heritage which that resoluteness, as thrown, takes over. Retrieval involves choosing which aspects of our cultural inheritance to preserve, transform, or reject in light of our resolute commitment to authentic existence. This process creates genuine historical continuity by connecting past, present, and future through resolute choice rather than mere causal sequence or abstract tradition. Heidegger describes the moment of vision, of anticipatory resoluteness, that has made up its mind to retrieve authentic possibilities from the heritage. Authentic historical existence neither rejects the past as irrelevant nor accepts it uncritically. Instead, it creatively appropriates inherited possibilities in light of chosen future commitments, revealing new meanings in traditional practices whilst transforming them for contemporary circumstances. Historical understanding thus transforms both our interpretation of the past and our projection into the future. By revealing the essential connection between individual authenticity and cultural inheritance, Heidegger shows that authentic historicity understands history as the occurrence of the possible. This recurrence is not cyclical repetition, but the disclosure of possibilities that remain available for creative appropriation across historical periods. We discover that authentic existence cannot be achieved in isolation from our historical context, but neither can we simply conform to inherited interpretations. Authenticity requires creative engagement with cultural possibilities that honors their origin, whilst transforming their meaning for present circumstances. This analysis points toward the profound connection between individual destiny and communal heritage, revealing how personal authenticity ultimately connects with shared historical responsibility and the collective task of preserving and transmitting cultural possibilities for future generations. Individual existence achieves its authentic coherence through what Heidegger calls destiny, or Schicksal. This is not fate imposed from outside, nor arbitrary self-creation, but something far more profound, the coherent life direction that emerges when we take full responsibility for our thrown existence. Destiny arises from authentic resoluteness about the inherited possibilities within our particular historical circumstances. As Heidegger puts it, if Dasein, by anticipatory resoluteness, lets itself be called forth to this possibility, then it can become the hero of its own existence. The hero here is not the romantic individual breaking free from all constraints, but the person who courageously appropriates their thrown situation for authentic future action. Destiny involves neither passive acceptance of circumstances nor the illusion that we create ourselves from nothing. Instead, it represents the mature recognition that authentic existence emerges precisely through resolute engagement with the concrete historical situation into which we have been thrown. This thrown situation provides what Heidegger calls heritage or Erbe. Heritage constitutes the cultural resources that make authentic existence possible within particular historical contexts. It encompasses the linguistic, practical, and interpretive possibilities we inherit from our cultural tradition. Heidegger emphasizes that Dasein can choose its hero from the inherited possibilities of its cultural heritage. Heritage is not a museum of dead artifacts to be preserved or discarded, but living possibilities that continue to shape what kinds of authentic existence are available within specific historical circumstances. The language we speak, the practices we inherit, the ways of understanding that have been passed down to us, these provide the concrete materials from which authentic existence must be fashioned. We cannot step outside our heritage to create ourselves from scratch, but neither are we simply determined by it. Rather, heritage provides the horizon within which authentic choice becomes possible. Authentic community emerges when individuals share what Heidegger calls historical destiny, or Geschick, whilst maintaining their individual resoluteness. This is not community based on conformity to common beliefs or values, but community grounded in mutual commitment to authentic existence within shared historical circumstances. As Heidegger explains, the destiny of the community, of the people, emerges in communication and in struggle. Authentic political action becomes possible when individuals support each other's authentic existence, whilst taking collective responsibility for inherited cultural possibilities. This represents a profound alternative to both individualistic politics, which ignores our essential interconnectedness, and collectivist politics, which dissolves individual responsibility into group conformity. This analysis grounds genuine political action in shared historical responsibility rather than abstract ideals or mere individual preference. Heidegger's insight that authentic historicity involves the repetitive disclosure of what has been there. Work. It cannot be based on timeless principles applied universally, nor on arbitrary preferences projected into the future. Instead, authentic political action emerges from the careful retrieval of inherited possibilities that can be authentically appropriated for present circumstances. This requires both individual resoluteness and communal dialogue about which inherited possibilities deserve to be carried forward and which should be allowed to fade away. Yet this analysis also reveals the essential connection between individual authenticity, communal solidarity, and historical responsibility, whilst pointing toward the limitations of approaching being through human categories alone. The analytic of Dasein, however profound, still approaches the question of being through the structure of human existence. This leads toward Heidegger's later turn, toward letting being speak for itself rather than interrogating it through human understanding. The question of being ultimately exceeds even the most authentic human engagement with it. Part 7. The turn from Dasein to being. Being and time remained incomplete not due to external circumstances or academic pressures, but because Heidegger discovered a fundamental flaw in his own approach. The analytic of Dasein, despite its revolutionary insights into human existence, could not adequately address being itself, the very question that had motivated the entire investigation from the beginning. Years later, Heidegger would reflect with startling honesty: the attempt in Being and Time, section 83, to derive human spatiality from temporality is untenable. This admission reveals more than a technical problem. It exposes the impossibility of the planned second part, which was to move from the analysis of Dasein to the question of being and time in general within the framework he had so carefully established. The fundamental difficulty lay in the approach itself. Even though Heidegger had positioned Dasein as the unique being for whom being is a question, this focus on human existence remained too anthropocentric to let being speak for itself. The existential analytic, despite avoiding traditional metaphysical categories, still approached being through distinctly human categories of understanding, projection, and temporality. Heidegger came to recognize that the language of metaphysics and metaphysics itself, whether that of Plato or of Kant, creates a conceptual barrier that first must be torn down if we are to go into the most elemental dimension of philosophy. But his own framework, sophisticated as it was, had not fully escaped this barrier. The deeper problem emerged as Heidegger realized that his very attempt to ground the question of being in human existence perpetuated the modern philosophical focus on subjectivity that he had sought to overcome. The entire tradition, from Descartes through Kant, had made consciousness, experience, or human understanding the starting point for philosophical investigation. By beginning with Dasein, even as the being who understands being, Heidegger found himself still trapped within this subjective orientation. As he later recognized, the thinking that inquires into the truth of being and so defines man's essential abode from being and toward being is neither ethics nor ontology. This recognition demanded a more fundamental transformation, one that would let being itself determine the direction of thinking rather than approaching being through any pre-given philosophical framework, however sophisticated. The incompletion of being and time thus represented not failure, but the discovery of a deeper necessity. The original question about the meaning of being had to be abandoned in favor of a more primordial inquiry. Not, what is the meaning of being? But how does being itself give meaning? This shift, which Heidegger would later call the Kehre, opened toward understanding being's own essential history as the unfolding of different epochal understandings that have shaped Western civilization. As he would formulate it, the question concerning technology is the question concerning the constellation in which revealing and concealment, in which the coming to presence of truth comes to pass. The incompletion of being and time thus marks not an ending but a beginning, the recognition that being itself must become the guide for thinking, rather than any analysis of the being who questions being. Being itself possesses an essential history. This history is not a chronicle of human ideas about being, nor the story of how various philosophers have understood existence. Rather, it represents the unfolding of different epochal understandings through which being has given itself in Western civilization. As Heidegger puts it, being itself is intrinsically historical, and the history of being is neither the history of man and of humanity, nor the history of the human relation to beings and to being. This insight transforms our understanding of what philosophy has been doing throughout its long development. Each historical epoch represents a fundamental way that being has revealed itself to human thinking. The Greeks experienced being as physis, the emerging into presence of beings that show themselves in their own radiant appearing. Medieval thinkers understood being as ens creatum, the created existence that flows from divine causation. The modern age interprets being as objectivity, standing before subjectivity, the realm of entities available for mathematical representation and technological manipulation. These are not simply different theories about the same underlying reality. They are different ways. Being itself has historically disclosed the whole of what is. Each epoch represents both a gift and a concealment. Being gives itself in a particular way, but this very giving conceals other possibilities, and ultimately conceals being's own essential hiddenness. Heidegger develops this through his concept of epochal thinking, where epoch means a holding back or withdrawal that opens a particular historical space for beings to appear. The Greek epoch revealed beings as emerging into presence but concealed beings' temporal character. The medieval epoch revealed beings as created but concealed their essential finitude. The modern epoch revealed beings as objects but concealed their intrinsic significance beyond utility. This process involves a progressive concealment, where each age covers over the previous understanding, whilst intensifying the forgetfulness of being itself. Heidegger diagnoses our condition. The oblivion of being makes itself known indirectly in the fact that man always and everywhere concerns himself only with beings. This historical trajectory reveals a systematic pattern where each epoch's way of revealing beings simultaneously conceals being more completely, culminating in the technological epoch's total concealment, where being disappears entirely behind the manipulation of beings as standing reserve. The technological age represents the completion of metaphysics, where being is so thoroughly forgotten that beings appear only as resources awaiting optimization. Yet this very completion opens a unique historical opportunity. Understanding beings' epochal history becomes essential for grasping how we arrived at technological enframing and what possibilities remain for future thinking beyond metaphysics. As Heidegger observes, only when we turn thoughtfully toward what has already been thought will we be turned to use for what must still be thought. This historical understanding opens the possibility for a new beginning of thought that corresponds to being's own movement of self-showing and self-concealing. Such thinking would let being be rather than grasping it through calculative concepts, pointing toward the meditative thinking that might prepare for being's next epochal disclosure. The crisis of modern thinking lies not in its sophistication, but in its fundamental character. Heidegger identifies two modes of thought that define our relationship to existence itself: calculative thinking, which dominates modernity, and meditative thinking, which opens the possibility of authentic encounter with being. This distinction cuts to the heart of why technological civilization, despite its remarkable achievements, leaves us increasingly alienated from the mystery of existence. Calculative thinking operates through manipulation and analysis, transforming everything into objects for human projects. As Heidegger observes in Discourse on Thinking, calculative thinking computes. It computes ever new, ever more promising, and, at the same time, more economical possibilities. Calculative thinking races from one prospect to the next. Calculative thinking never stops, never collects itself. This restless computation characterizes not only scientific method, but the entire modern approach to existence. Everything becomes resource, data, opportunity for enhancement or exploitation. Nature becomes standing reserve, other people become human resources. Even our own existence becomes a project to be optimized. The problem isn't that calculative thinking is wrong, but that it cannot access being. When we approach existence calculatively, we encounter only what we've already determined to find. The scientific method reveals aspects of nature, but only those aspects that conform to mathematical measurement and experimental manipulation. Technology produces remarkable results, but only by reducing reality to what can be controlled and predicted. Calculative thinking creates a closed circle, where being never appears as anything other than what human projects require it to be. Meditative thinking represents a fundamental transformation of our relationship to existence. Rather than grasping or controlling, it opens itself to being's own self-showing and self-concealing movement. Heidegger calls this Gelassenheit, releasement, or letting be, which he describes as a letting be of what is, that allows beings to appear in their own character rather than forcing them into human categories. This requires abandoning the will to master that has driven Western philosophy since Plato's attempt to capture being in eternal forms. Meditative thinking doesn't seek to solve the question of being, but to dwell within it authentically. It learns to correspond to being's own rhythm of revealing and concealing, accepting that mystery and hiddenness belong essentially to truth rather than representing failures of human knowledge. This thinking moves slowly, gathers itself, remains open to what cannot be predicted or produced. It requires what Heidegger calls a step back, from the urgency of calculative projects into patient attention to what is already present but overlooked. This transformation demands a fundamental change in philosophical language itself. Traditional metaphysics uses assertive propositions that claim to capture truth in concepts and systems. Meditative thinking requires what Heidegger calls meditative saying that lets truth happen rather than forcing it into predetermined categories. As he puts it, language is the house of being. In its home, man dwells. Authentic thinking must learn to dwell within language, rather than using it as a mere tool for communication or manipulation. This points toward poetry, especially Hölderlin's work, as preserving the essential relationship between language and being. Poetic language doesn't describe objects but opens worlds, doesn't convey information but lets being show itself in its own character. The poet learns to listen to language's own movement, rather than imposing human intentions upon it. This suggests that the recovery of authentic thinking requires recovering the poetic dimension of language that technological thinking systematically eliminates. Yet meditative thinking cannot guarantee or produce a new understanding of being. It can only prepare for the possible advent of a new epochal revelation that would move beyond technological enframing. Heidegger insists that we can neither force nor fabricate the advent of a new epoch, but can only prepare through patient thinking that remains open to being's possible self-giving. Part 8. Technology and Enframing. Technology shapes our world so fundamentally that we rarely question what technology itself means. Heidegger argues that our relationship to technology remains superficial so long as we focus on particular devices, machines, or digital systems. The essence of technology lies not in technological things, but in a specific way of revealing that transforms how all beings can appear to us. In The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger makes a startling claim. The essence of technology is nothing technological. Thus, we shall never experience our relationship to the essence of technology, so long as we merely conceive and push forward the technological, put up with it. This insight cuts through our usual assumptions about technology as neutral tools that we simply use well or badly. The essence of technology operates as what Heidegger calls enframing, a totalizing framework that makes everything appear as standing reserve available for technological manipulation and optimization. Enframing reveals all beings as resources optimized for flexible use within technological systems. Material objects become raw materials to be processed and stored. Human beings become human resources, managed through systems of efficiency and productivity. Education transforms into human resource development, designed to produce optimal workers. Nature becomes natural resources, waiting to be unlocked, extracted, and redistributed according to technological demands. Heidegger illustrates this transformation through his analysis of the hydroelectric plant on the Rhine. The plant sets the river to supplying hydraulic pressure, which sets the turbines turning. The river no longer flows as a natural force, but exists primarily as hydraulic energy stored and released on demand. The plant reveals the river as standing reserve, something that stands ready for technological use, its essence defined by its availability for energy production. This way of revealing extends far beyond particular technologies. Enframing operates as the epochal way being gives itself in the modern age, determining how beings can show themselves to us. Everything appears primarily in terms of its potential for optimization, efficiency, and flexible deployment within technological systems. Even human activities like thinking, creating, and dwelling get reorganized according to technological categories of input, output, and measurable results. Heidegger argues that enframing represents the culmination of Western metaphysics' will to master and control beings. The subject-object distinction reaches its extreme form where everything becomes object for technological subjectivity. Enframing is the gathering together of that setting upon which sets upon man and puts him in position to reveal the real, in the mode of ordering as standing reserve. This gathering operates not through individual human decisions, but as the way being conceals itself most completely in the technological age. Modern technology completes the metaphysical tradition by making being disappear entirely behind the calculative manipulation of beings. When everything appears as standing reserve, the question of being itself gets forgotten. We become so absorbed in managing, optimizing, and controlling beings that we lose sight of the more fundamental question of what it means for anything to be at all. Heidegger warns that the rule of enframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth. Enframing blocks access to other ways beings might reveal themselves, as things that gather world, as artworks that open truth, as natural forces that resist human control. The danger lies not in particular technologies, but in enframing's totalizing claim to be the only legitimate way of revealing. This analysis reveals technology not as neutral tool, but as the way being conceals itself most completely in our historical moment. Understanding enframing opens the question of how standing reserve transforms our relationship to things, nature, and ourselves, pointing toward possibilities for a more original relationship to being that might emerge from within the technological age itself. Standing reserve represents a fundamental transformation in how beings can appear to us, no longer as things with their own intrinsic character, or as equipment embedded in meaningful contexts, but as flexible resources optimized for maximum efficiency within technological systems. Heidegger captures this precisely. Everywhere, everything is ordered to stand by, to be immediately at hand, indeed to stand there just so that it may be on call for a further ordering. This differs qualitatively from traditional tools that served human purposes, whilst maintaining their own distinctive character. A hammer remains recognizably a hammer, even when not in use, embedded in a workshop's meaningful context. But standing reserve dissolves such stable identities into pure availability for technological manipulation. This transformation extends systematically beyond material objects to encompass nature, human activities, and ultimately, human beings themselves. Nature becomes natural resources to be unlocked, stored and distributed through technological networks. Rivers become hydroelectric potential, forests become timber reserves, mountains become mineral deposits, awaiting extraction. Human activities undergo similar transformation. Education becomes human resource development. Healthcare becomes health delivery systems. Relationships become social capital to be leveraged. We increasingly understand ourselves through technological categories of efficiency, optimization, and resource management. Heidegger recognizes that man himself belongs to standing reserve. We must optimize our skills, health, and productivity to serve technological systems that demand constant adaptation and improvement. The systematic character reveals itself in the relentless demand for optimization. Everything must be made more efficient, more flexible, more responsive to technological manipulation, creating a totalizing framework that admits no outside perspective. Heidegger observes that the revealing that rules throughout modern technology has the character of a setting upon, in the sense of a challenging forth. This challenging forth creates systematic pressure for constant improvement, innovation, and optimization that transforms all relationships into technological problems requiring solutions. Nothing escapes this imperative. Cities must be smart. Bodies must be optimized, minds must be enhanced, relationships must be networked for maximum efficiency and productivity. The supreme danger emerges through totalization's concealment of its own essence. Standing reserve appears as simply the way things are, rather than one particular way of revealing, making the technological framework invisible and therefore seemingly natural and inevitable, rather than historically contingent and questionable. Heidegger warns that the threat to man does not come in the first instance from the potentially lethal machines and apparatus of technology, but from Enframing's concealment of other ways of revealing. When technological revealing becomes the only way beings can appear, we lose access to alternative possibilities for understanding ourselves and our world. This concealment creates both the supreme danger and, paradoxically, the possibility of salvation, for only by recognizing Enframing as one way of revealing among others can we recover the question of being itself. Enframing presents what Heidegger identifies as the supreme danger, not because it threatens physical destruction, but because it poses a more fundamental threat to the very possibility of revealing itself. This danger lies in Enframing's tendency to consume all other ways of revealing, making technological manipulation appear as the only meaningful relationship to beings. As Heidegger warns, the danger is that the coming to presence of technology threatens it with the possibility that all revealing will be consumed in ordering, and that everything will present itself only in the unconcealedness of standing reserve. The danger is not nuclear war or environmental catastrophe, but the more essential threat that we will lose the capacity to experience beings in any way other than as resources awaiting optimization. This supreme danger extends to human self-understanding itself. When technological revealing becomes total, humans risk understanding themselves purely in technological terms, losing touch with the essential structures of existence revealed in the analytic of Dasein. Heidegger articulates this precipice. As soon as what is unconcealed no longer concerns man even as object, but does so, rather, exclusively as standing reserve, and man in the midst of objectlessness is nothing but the orderer of the standing reserve. Then he comes to the very brink of a precipitous fall. Under complete enframing, anxiety becomes merely a problem to be managed. Conscience transforms into algorithmic decision-making, and mortality becomes simply a technical challenge to overcome. The phenomena that open authentic existence, those fundamental attunements that reveal our thrown, finite, temporal being, threaten to disappear entirely under technological self-interpretation. Yet within this very extremity, Heidegger discovers the possibility of salvation. Drawing on Hölderlin's verse, he observes, "But where danger is, grows the saving power also." The essence of technology, precisely as the destining of revealing that poses the supreme danger, simultaneously harbors within itself what he calls the saving power. Technology's very extremity, its total concealment of being, may awaken thinking to what it conceals, by making the concealment so complete that it becomes visible as concealment, rather than remaining invisible. When Enframing reaches its ultimate expression, its character as merely one possible way of revealing may finally become apparent, opening space for other possibilities of disclosure. The saving power emerges not through rejecting technology, but through thinking its essence and recognizing its limitations. Whilst learning to inhabit the tension between technological necessity and other ways of revealing, Heidegger suggests we can affirm the unavoidable use of technical devices and also deny them the right to dominate us, and so to warp, confuse, and lay waste our nature. This points toward a form of authentic dwelling that neither rejects modernity nor submits completely to technological enframing. Instead, it learns to use technological devices whilst remaining open to non-technological ways of revealing, to the disclosure of beings in their beauty, their mystery, their resistance to complete manipulation. This saving power prepares the ground for understanding how art opens up truth by revealing the essential tension between world and earth, showing beings in their unconcealment, while simultaneously preserving their concealment, their inexhaustible depth that no technological revealing can fully master or reduce to standing reserve. Part 9. Art and the Origin of Truth. Truth appears to us as the agreement between our statements and the facts they describe. When we say, "The cat is on the mat," and there indeed sits a cat upon a mat, we call this statement true. This understanding has dominated Western thought since Aristotle, defining truth as correspondence, adequatio, the matching of mind to world. Yet Heidegger discovers in this familiar notion a profound forgetting, a concealment of something far more fundamental that the Greeks understood, but that subsequent philosophy buried beneath layers of theoretical abstraction. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means unconcealment or unhiddenness. This etymology reveals that truth, in its most primordial sense, is not a property that statements possess when they correctly represent reality. Truth is rather the dynamic process by which beings emerge from hiddenness into the open clearing, where they can be encountered at all. As Heidegger writes in The Origin of the Work of Art, truth is untruth, insofar as there belongs to it the reservoir of the not yet uncovered, the uncovered in the sense of concealment. Truth names the fundamental happening that makes it possible for there to be anything like correspondence between statements and facts. This unconcealment always occurs against a background of hiddenness that can never be completely eliminated. Every act of revealing necessarily conceals other possibilities. When we encounter a piece of wood as a hammer, we conceal its potential as sculpture or fuel. When we approach the forest scientifically, measuring biomass and calculating carbon absorption, we conceal its character as sacred grove or dwelling place of mystery. As Heidegger puts it, to be a being means to hold oneself within unconcealment, to stand within the revealed, to exist within appearance and show oneself within it. Yet this appearance always occurs within a horizon of the unthought, the withdrawn, the not yet revealed. Truth as unconcealment reveals itself most powerfully in the work of art. Great artworks do not represent or copy what already exists in the world. They open up entirely new worlds of meaning, creating the interpretive frameworks within which beings can show themselves as significant. Heidegger's famous analysis of Van Gogh's painting of peasant shoes demonstrates this world-opening power. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain, and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. The painting does not simply show us what peasant shoes look like. It opens up the entire world of peasant existence, the rhythm of rural labor, the relationship between human dwelling and the cycles of earth and sky. Art achieves this revelation by establishing what Heidegger calls the strife between world and earth. World names the meaningful context within which beings show up as significant, the network of references and purposes that makes understanding possible. Earth names the self-concealing ground that supports and nourishes all revealing, whilst remaining itself withdrawn from complete comprehension. Great artworks hold these two forces in productive tension, preventing world from becoming a closed system of meanings, whilst preventing Earth from retreating into complete hiddenness. This understanding reveals art's essential relationship to truth, not as aesthetic decoration or cultural ornament, but as one of the fundamental ways being gives itself. The artwork creates the open space, the clearing, within which beings can appear and propositional statements can be made about them. Poetry, painting, sculpture, and music do not describe a pre-existing reality, but participate in the very coming to presence of beings. They are modes of truth happening, ways unconcealment occurs. This analysis transforms our understanding of what it means for something to be true. Truth becomes not a static property, but a dynamic event. Not the possession of correct statements, but the opening of the space within which correctness becomes possible. The essence of truth is the truth of essence, where essence means not fixed properties, but the way beings come to presence, the how of their self-showing. Art reveals this more primordial truth by creating new possibilities for understanding and dwelling, by opening worlds that had not existed before the artwork brought them into being. Truth emerges neither from correct propositions nor from mental representations, but from the dynamic tension between two fundamental dimensions that Heidegger calls world and earth. World constitutes the open realm of meaning within which beings can show up as significant, not the physical universe, but the interpretive context that allows things to matter in particular ways. As Heidegger explains, world is not the mere collection of the countable or uncountable, familiar and unfamiliar things that are just there. But neither is world a merely imagined framework added by our representation to the sum of such given things. World opens up the space of significance, where beings can appear as tools ready for use, obstacles demanding navigation, opportunities inviting action, or sacred objects commanding reverence, depending entirely on the world's particular character and historical moment. Earth functions as the self-concealing ground that supports and limits all unconcealment, the mysterious source from which beings emerge and into which they withdraw, always exceeding our attempts to master or fully understand it. Heidegger reveals that the earth is that whence the arising brings back and shelters everything that arises without violation. In the things that arise, earth is present as the sheltering agent. Earth represents not merely physical nature, but the essential hiddenness that makes all revealing possible whilst remaining itself concealed. Every act of understanding depends upon this mysterious ground that can never be completely illuminated or controlled. The relationship between world and earth constitutes what Heidegger calls essential strife, the dynamic tension that keeps truth alive, rather than allowing it to calcify into fixed doctrine. The world, in resting upon the earth, strives to surmount it. As self-opening, it cannot endure anything closed. The earth, however, as sheltering and concealing, tends always to draw the world into itself and keep it there. This strife reveals itself as the fundamental structure of truth. DC, not conflict requiring resolution, but the essential tension that prevents truth from becoming either empty abstraction or mere chaos. World needs Earth's mysterious depth to avoid becoming hollow interpretation, whilst Earth needs world's openness to avoid remaining undifferentiated obscurity. Great artworks preserve and intensify this strife rather than resolving it, thereby establishing truth as an ongoing event rather than a completed achievement. Consider Heidegger's analysis of the Greek temple. Standing there, the building rests on the rocky ground. This resting of the work draws up, out of the rock, the mystery of that rock's clumsy yet spontaneous support. The temple neither simply represents the divine, nor merely decorates the landscape, but establishes the tension between meaningful interpretation and mysterious depth that constitutes truth's essential structure. Through this establishment, artworks found new historical worlds by opening fresh possibilities for dwelling and understanding, revealing how truth happens through the preserved strife between openness and concealment. Great artworks do not merely represent or reflect the world as it already exists. They accomplish something far more fundamental. They found new historical worlds by opening up the essential interpretations that guide how entire communities understand themselves and their relationship to beings. When Heidegger declares that whenever art happens, that is, whenever there is a beginning, a thrust enters history, history either begins or starts over again. He reveals art's revolutionary power to establish the very foundations upon which cultures build their understanding of existence. The Greek temple, the Gothic cathedral, Beethoven's symphonies. These works do not simply mirror their historical moments, but create the interpretive possibilities within which those cultures can grasp themselves and their world. This founding occurs through art's unique capacity to establish the strife between world and earth in concrete, enduring form. The temple work exemplifies this process perfectly. As Heidegger observes, the temple work, standing there, opens up a world and at the same time sets this world back again on earth, which itself only thus emerges as native ground. The Greek temple does not merely house religious activities or demonstrate architectural skill. It opens up the entire Greek understanding of gods and mortals, earth and sky, while simultaneously grounding this understanding in the particular landscape, materials, and historical situation of Greece. The temple's columns, fashioned from local stone, reveal both the divine order that governs human existence and the earthly foundation upon which that order rests. This is why great works endure across centuries, continuing to speak to communities long after their original historical context has passed. They preserve truth not by providing final answers or complete revelations, but by maintaining the essential tension between revealing and concealing that characterizes all authentic disclosure of being. Heidegger recognizes that art, as the setting into work of truth, is poetry. Not only the creation of the work is poetic, but equally poetic, though in its own way, is the preserving of the work. Authentic artworks remain inexhaustible sources of meaning precisely because they resist reduction to single interpretations or mere historical artifacts. They continue opening new possibilities for understanding whilst preserving the fundamental questions that make such understanding necessary. This analysis reveals art's essential political and historical function, not as propaganda or entertainment, but as the preservation of those essential tensions that make authentic communal existence possible. Artworks provide historical communities with the fundamental interpretations that guide authentic existence. By keeping alive the essential questions about dwelling, mortality, the sacred, and the relationship between humans and being. When Heidegger describes art as the becoming and happening of truth that sets up a world whilst setting forth the earth, he shows how great works establish the interpretive framework within which a people can authentically dwell. They preserve the strife between concealment and unconcealment that prevents communities from falling into the complacency of taking their world as simply given or natural. This understanding points toward the recognition that language and poetry represent the most fundamental form of this truth-preserving activity, for it is through language that the interpretive possibilities opened by artworks become available for communal dwelling and historical existence. Part 10. Language and Poetry. Language appears as our tool, an instrument we deploy to convey thoughts from mind to mind, to package ideas for efficient transmission. Yet, this instrumental understanding, Heidegger argues, fundamentally misapprehends language's essential nature and conceals its most profound function. What if language is not something we possess and manipulate, but rather the dwelling place where being itself can show itself? This reversal transforms our entire relationship to words, meaning, and human existence itself. In his letter on humanism, Heidegger offers a striking formulation that reorients our understanding completely. Language is the house of being. In its home man dwells. Those who think and those who create with words are the guardians of this home. This metaphor of dwelling reveals that we do not stand outside language as subjects manipulating an object tool. Rather, we exist within language as the fundamental condition that makes meaningful existence possible. We inhabit linguistic frameworks that provide the interpretive possibilities through which beings can become significant, through which anything can matter at all. This dwelling relationship means we don't possess language, but rather, language possesses us. We inherit languages already saturated with interpretations of what it means to be human. What counts as real? How beings can be significant? These inherited frameworks shape not merely how we express ourselves, but what can appear as worthy of expression. What kinds of beings can show themselves? What possibilities for existence remain open or closed? Heidegger emphasizes this priority. It is in words and language that things first come into being and are. Words don't wrap pre-existing things like packages for commercial exchange. Rather, words allow things to emerge into presence, to gather their essential character, to be what they are. Yet, modern technological thinking reduces language to information exchange, data processing, efficient communication. Language becomes another resource to be optimized, standardized, made uniformly accessible. Heidegger diagnoses this transformation. Language is monstrously overtaken by the public character of language. Language thereby falls into the service of expediting communication along routes, where objectification, MC, the uniform accessibility of everything to everyone, branches out and disregards all limits. This technological communication prioritizes speed, efficiency, control over the patient letting be that allows authentic understanding to unfold. When language serves technological enframing, it forces beings into predetermined categories, rather than allowing them to show themselves in their own character. Everything becomes information to be processed, transmitted, stored. The subtle disclosure that language makes possible, the way words can open new regions of meaning, reveal previously hidden aspects of existence, gets flattened into mere data exchange. Language loses its capacity to let beings be, and becomes instead an instrument for making beings available for manipulation and control. The recovery of essential language requires attending to language itself, not as tool, but as the happening of truth. Heidegger points toward this essential dimension. We would reflect on language itself and on language only. Language itself is process. Language and nothing else besides. This reflection discovers language in its most primordial function, not representing pre-given reality, but bringing new worlds into being, through original naming, through words that gather and preserve the essential relationships between earth and sky, mortals and divinities. Poetry, especially the work of Hölderlin, preserves this essential relationship between language and being. Poetic language doesn't merely describe or communicate, but creates the space within which beings can appear in their truth. The poet becomes guardian of language's house, protecting its capacity for original disclosure against the flattening effects of technological communication. Through authentic language that corresponds to being's own movement of self-showing and self-concealing, the recovery of essential dwelling becomes possible, opening pathways beyond technological enframing toward more primordial ways of being, with beings in their truth. Poetry, for Heidegger, represents language in its most essential function, not the description of what already exists, but the primordial naming that brings new possibilities into being. When we encounter the work of Friedrich Hölderlin, we witness language operating at this foundational level, creating the very interpretive frameworks within which beings can first become meaningful. This is why Heidegger declares in Hölderlin and the Essence of Poetry that poetry is the primitive language of a historical people. Therefore, the essence of language must be understood through the essence of poetry. Poetry differs fundamentally from both everyday communication and scientific description, precisely because it doesn't merely convey information about an already established world, but opens up new worlds through original acts of naming. The poet's naming is not simply attaching labels to pre-existing objects. When Heidegger analyzes Hölderlin's work, he reveals how authentic poetic language brings forth what he calls the essential word that allows beings to show themselves as what they are for the first time. As Heidegger puts it, the poet names the gods and names all things in that which they are. This naming does not consist merely in something already known being supplied with a name. It is rather that, when the poet speaks the essential word, the existent is by this naming nominated as what it is. This primordial naming creates the clearing within which beings can emerge into presence, establishing the fundamental relationships between earth and sky, mortals and divinities that constitute what Heidegger calls the fourfold of authentic dwelling. Hölderlin's verse, full of merit, yet poetically a man dwells on this earth, becomes crucial for understanding how poetry reveals the essential relationship between authentic dwelling and the capacity to receive and preserve the mystery of being. Human beings dwell poetically when they remain open to the self-showing and self-concealing movement of being itself, rather than attempting to master beings through technological manipulation or metaphysical concepts. This poetic dwelling requires what Heidegger calls meditative thinking that learns to correspond to being's own rhythm of revelation and withdrawal. Great poets function as shepherds of being, who preserve and transmit the essential relationship between language and truth across historical epochs, when this relationship faces particular threats. In our technological age, dominated by what Heidegger calls enframing, the poet's vocation becomes especially crucial. The poet's historical mission, as Heidegger understands it, is to call all the brightness and darkness and the whole of world history into the essential word. Hölderlin's poetry preserves the possibility of authentic dwelling, precisely when calculative thinking threatens to reduce all beings to standing reserve, resources available for technological manipulation. This preservation is not mere conservation of past meanings, but the active preparation for new possibilities of understanding that might emerge from the dialogue between thinking and poetry. Heidegger suggests that poetic thinking offers an alternative to both metaphysical philosophy and technological calculation, by learning to correspond to being's own movement through language that lets beings be, rather than grasping them conceptually. As he puts it, thinking is the thinking of being. The genitive says two things. Thinking is of being inasmuch as thinking, coming to pass from being, belongs to being. At the same time, thinking is thinking of being insofar as thinking, belonging to being, listens to being. This listening quality of authentic thinking mirrors the receptive attentiveness that characterizes genuine poetic language. Both the thinker and the poet must learn to wait upon being's own self-disclosure rather than imposing predetermined frameworks of interpretation. This waiting is not passive, but requires the most active kind of readiness, the capacity to respond appropriately when being grants moments of unconcealment. Through this dialogue between thinking and poetry, possibilities open for what Heidegger calls post-metaphysical thought, that neither dominates beings through concepts nor abandons the essential task of understanding our relationship to being itself. The most thought-provoking revelation of our thought-provoking time, Heidegger declares, is that we are still not thinking. This startling claim strikes at the heart of Western philosophy's most fundamental assumptions about the nature of thought itself. For centuries, we have mistaken calculation, analysis, and conceptual manipulation for genuine thinking, never questioning whether our assertive, grasping approach to truth might actually prevent us from encountering what most needs to be thought. Authentic thinking, Heidegger reveals, must learn to correspond to being's own movement of self-showing and self-concealing, rather than imposing human concepts and categories upon being. Traditional philosophy approaches being like a hunter stalking prey, seeking to capture truth within the nets of systematic theory and propositional knowledge. Yet this very approach ensures that what is most essential in being withdraws from our grasp, for being cannot be forced into the rigid frameworks of metaphysical thinking without losing precisely what makes it being, rather than mere beings. The transformation Heidegger envisions requires moving from assertive propositions that claim to capture truth definitively to what he calls meditative, saying that opens space for truth to happen whilst preserving its essential mystery. This distinction between mere talking and authentic saying proves crucial for understanding how language itself must be transformed. To say means to show, to make appear, to let be seen and heard, Heidegger explains, revealing how genuine philosophical language must learn from poetry's capacity to let beings show themselves rather than reducing them to objects of theoretical analysis or technological manipulation. Such saying requires recognizing that language speaks, rather than being merely a tool we use for human purposes. This reversal proves more radical than it initially appears, for it reveals thinking not as a human activity that grasps being, but as being's own self-thinking that happens through human existence when we learn to listen and respond, rather than dominate and control. Man speaks in that he responds to language, Heidegger observes, showing how authentic thinking emerges only when we abandon the illusion of linguistic mastery and allow ourselves to become the place where being speaks itself into presence. The dialogue between thinking and poetry opens possibilities for post-metaphysical thought that neither abandons rigorous inquiry nor falls back into traditional metaphysical concepts. Poetry reveals how language can preserve the essential mystery of beings whilst allowing them to appear in their truth, offering thinking a model for how to approach being without violating its essential hiddenness. The poet does not explain the essence of things, but creates the linguistic space within which things can show themselves as they are, teaching thinking how to prepare for truth's arrival rather than demanding its immediate presence. This preparation involves what Heidegger calls thinking as thanking, where authentic thought responds gratefully to being's self-giving rather than demanding explanations or seeking mastery. Such thinking learns to dwell within the tension between being's revealing and concealing, neither forcing premature closure nor abandoning the rigorous pursuit of understanding. It discovers that the highest form of thinking might be learning how to wait thoughtfully for being's possible self-revelation, holding ourselves open to what cannot be anticipated or controlled. The transformation of thinking and saying thus points toward a fundamental reorientation of philosophy's task from constructing systematic theories to preparing for being's possible self-revelation. This preparation requires developing new forms of philosophical discourse that can preserve mystery whilst remaining intellectually rigorous, creating linguistic spaces where truth can happen, rather than places where truth is stored. Such discourse learns from poetry's capacity to let language itself become the house of being, where mortals can dwell authentically within the unified structure that gathers earth and sky, mortals and divinities, into their essential belonging together. Part 11. The Fourfold and Dwelling. Authentic dwelling requires understanding our place within a meaningful cosmos, rather than treating space as empty geometric extension to be filled with objects. Modern existence suffers from a profound homelessness that cannot be remedied merely by constructing more buildings or optimizing living spaces. The question becomes urgent. What constitutes this meaningful space of human existence? Heidegger reveals the essence of this problem in Building Dwelling Thinking when he observes that we attain to dwelling, so it seems, only by means of building. The latter, building, has the former, dwelling, as its goal. Yet this apparent relationship conceals a deeper crisis. Modern construction typically destroys rather than preserves dwelling by reducing space to functional optimization and geometric coordinates, rather than creating places that gather meaningful relationships. Contemporary building practices exemplify this destruction of dwelling through their relentless pursuit of efficiency. Architects design structures as containers for human activities, calculating square footage and optimizing traffic flow whilst remaining oblivious to the essential character of place. Housing developments sprawl across landscapes without regard for the natural rhythms and relationships that make dwelling possible. Each structure stands as an isolated unit within homogeneous space, connected to others only through abstract measurements and property lines. This approach treats the earth as mere ground to be covered, the sky as empty space to be filled, and humans as consumers of spatial commodities. Heidegger identifies the fourfold as the essential structure within which authentic dwelling becomes possible. This fourfold consists of four fundamental dimensions: earth as the supporting and nourishing ground, sky as the encompassing openness of weather and seasons, mortals as the finite beings who can question and dwell, and divinities as the measure of what is holy and worthy of reverence. These are not separate entities that somehow come together, but rather aspects of a unified structure that makes meaningful existence possible. Earth and sky, divinities and mortals belong together in the unity of the fourfold, Heidegger explains, revealing how authentic dwelling requires recognition of and participation within this primordial unity. The earth provides the material foundation for all dwelling, not as raw material to be exploited, but as the source that nourishes and sustains life. It offers the stone for building, the wood for shelter, the soil for cultivation. Yet earth also withholds itself, remaining mysterious in its depths and resistant to complete mastery. The sky encompasses this earthly foundation, providing the openness within which weather unfolds, seasons cycle, and the celestial movements mark time's passage. Sky brings light and darkness, storm and calm. The changing conditions that make earthly life dynamic rather than static is less than #0. Jinghao Dayu. Mortals exist as the beings capable of recognizing their place within this natural context, while simultaneously transcending it through language, thought, and care. They alone among earthly beings can question the meaning of existence and take responsibility for preserving the relationships that make dwelling possible. The divinities represent the dimension of the holy. the measure of what deserves reverence and what calls mortals beyond their immediate concerns toward what is highest and most worthy of devotion. These four dimensions mirror each other in their essential belonging together. Earth and sky form the natural context within which life unfolds, whilst mortals and divinities constitute the spiritual dimension that gives meaning and measure to existence. Heidegger illuminates this mirroring relationship. Each of the four mirrors in its own way the presence of the others. Each of the four mirrors itself in its own way into its own. Within the simpleness of the four, Earth provides the material foundation that sky encompasses, creating the space within which growth and decay, building and weathering occur. Mortals receive their measure from divinities who remain essentially mysterious and withdrawn, never fully present or comprehensible, yet providing the standard by which authentic existence becomes possible. This mirroring reveals that the Fourfold is not a collection of separate domains, but a unified structure where each dimension requires and reflects the others. Earth, without sky, would be a closed, lifeless mass. Authentic building preserves dwelling by gathering the Fourfold rather than merely providing shelter or functional space optimized for human activities. Heidegger's analysis of the Black Forest farmhouse reveals this essential relationship. Here, the self-sufficiency of the power to let earth and sky, divinities and mortals enter in simple oneness into things ordered the house. The traditional farmhouse worked with natural materials drawn from the local earth, timber from surrounding forests, stone from nearby quarries, creating structures that remained connected to their place of origin. These buildings oriented themselves toward the sky's seasonal rhythms, with deep eaves to shelter from winter storms and wide windows to welcome summer light. They provided space for the rituals that connect mortals with divinities, the hearth, where families gathered, the rooms where births and deaths occurred, the thresholds where sacred and ordinary met. Most fundamentally, they created places where generations could dwell rather than merely reside temporarily, spaces that held memory and meaning across time. Modern construction often destroys dwelling by reducing space to geometric coordinates and functional optimization without regard for the Fourfold's essential relationships. Heidegger observes this loss. The truck driver is at home on the highway, but he does not have his lodgings there. The working woman is at home at the spinning mill, but does not have her dwelling place there. Technological construction creates spaces for efficient function, but eliminates the meaningful relationships between earth, sky, mortals, and divinities that make dwelling possible. Buildings become abstract containers, constructed from materials with no connection to their place, designed according to universal principles rather than local conditions, optimized for productivity rather than meaningful habitation. These structures may house human activities, but they cannot gather the Fourfold or preserve the relationships that allow authentic dwelling to unfold. Dwelling itself is not an activity we perform, but our fundamental way of being in the world, the basic structure of human existence as essentially relational and place-bound, rather than isolated and mobile. Heidegger clarifies this priority. We do not dwell because we have built, but we build and have built because we dwell. That is, because we are dwellers. Dwelling names the essential structure revealed in the earlier analysis of being in the world, but now understood in terms of our relationship to the Fourfold rather than just practical involvement with equipment. To dwell means to exist within the gathered relationships of earth and sky, mortals and divinities, finding our place within these essential connections rather than standing apart from them as detached subjects, manipulating objects. Thinking itself emerges as a form of building that constructs dwelling places for authentic existence by preserving the essential relationships and tensions that make meaningful life possible. Heidegger describes this thinking as building. Thinking builds upon the house of being, the house in which the jointure of being, in its destinal unfolding, enjoins the essence of man, to dwell in the truth of being. Authentic philosophical thinking doesn't construct abstract theories, but creates conceptual spaces where the essential relationships between being and human existence can be preserved and transmitted. This thinking prepares the ground for understanding how simple things gather the fourfold and create genuine places where dwelling becomes possible once again. Simple things possess an extraordinary power that modernity has largely forgotten. A clay jug, a wooden bridge, a handcrafted table. These humble objects carry within themselves the capacity to gather what Heidegger calls allowing each dimension of existence to appear in its essential character rather than being reduced to mere technological function. This gathering represents something fundamentally different from how we typically encounter objects in our technological age. Consider Heidegger's profound analysis of the jug from The Thing. The jug's jug character consists in the poured gift of the pouring. Even the empty jug retains its nature by the poured gift. The jug's essence lies not in its physical properties, as measured by science, nor in its utility as defined by technology, but in its capacity to gather the fourfold through the act of pouring. Through its clay material, the jug gathers earth, the supporting, nourishing ground from which it emerged. Through the water it holds, it gathers sky, the vaulting expanse that provides rain and weather. Through the act of pouring and drinking, it gathers mortals. Human beings in their essential capacity for dwelling and community. Through its role in ritual offerings and celebrations, it gathers divinities, the sacred dimension that gives meaning and depth to human existence. This gathering creates something remarkable. Genuine places that support community and authentic temporal existence, rather than mere locations in geometric space. Heidegger's analysis of the bridge illuminates this distinction. The bridge gathers the earth as landscape around the stream. Thus, it guides and attends the stream through the meadows. Resting upright in the stream's flow, the bridge piers bear the swing of the arches that leave the stream's waters to run their course. The bridge doesn't merely provide transportation from point A to point B. It creates a place where the community can gather, where the relationships between earth, sky, mortals, and divinities become visible and meaningful. The bridge allows the landscape to appear as landscape rather than as raw material. The stream to flow as a living watercourse rather than as a resource to be managed, and the community to experience itself as dwelling within the fourfold rather than simply occupying space. This reveals the crucial distinction between things and mere objects. Things possess the capacity to gather world and preserve the essential tensions of existence, whilst objects have been reduced to standing reserve for technological manipulation. As Heidegger puts it, the thing's world. Each thing stays the fourfold into a happening of the simple onehood of world. Authentic things preserve the mystery and depth that technological objects systematically eliminate. A handcrafted table carries within itself the history of the tree from which it was made, the skill and care of the craftsperson who shaped it, and the cultural practices of shared meals and conversation that give it meaning. Mass-produced furniture, by contrast, has been stripped of these dimensions, reduced to standardized units, optimized for efficiency and consumption. Learning to dwell authentically with things offers a genuine alternative to the technological reduction of everything to standing reserve. This dwelling preserves spaces where beings can appear in their own character, rather than merely as resources for optimization. Heidegger's concept of letting things be represents a fundamental alternative to technological manipulation, not passive indifference, but an active attentiveness that allows beings to show themselves as they are, rather than forcing them into predetermined categories of usefulness. This analysis points toward the possibility of inhabiting modernity without being completely dominated by technological enframing. We can learn to use technological devices whilst preserving other ways of revealing through authentic dwelling with things that gather the fourfold. This preservation creates spaces of resistance within technological society, moments where the question of being can emerge anew with all the insights gained through our complete philosophical journey into the depths of existence itself. Part 12. The question of being revisited. The entire trajectory of Western philosophy rests upon a fundamental misunderstanding. From Plato's eternal forms to Aristotle's substance, from medieval being to modern objectivity, Western thought has consistently interpreted being in terms of presence. This interpretation treats being as the most universal feature of what stands before us, the most general characteristic that all beings share. Yet this approach, Heidegger argues, leads to the systematic forgetfulness of being's essential temporal and finite character. As he formulates in his later work, being has been thought on the basis of beings and for beings as their most universal and therefore their most indeterminate concept. This conceptual framework transforms being into an empty abstraction, the highest genus under which all particular beings fall. This metaphysical tradition fundamentally misses what being actually is. Being is not a being amongst other beings, nor is it presence itself. Rather, being is the temporal event of unconcealment that makes presence possible, whilst remaining itself essentially withdrawn and concealed. In Time and Being, Heidegger offers a revolutionary formulation. Being is not. There are. That is, there is given being. As the unconcealing of beings, this statement reveals being not as something that exists, but as the giving or granting that allows beings to come into unconcealment. Being gives beings their being, but this giving is itself not a being. It is the temporal happening that opens the space within which beings can appear and be encountered. This giving involves essential finitude and withdrawal. Being gives itself precisely by withholding itself, reveals itself through concealment, makes beings present by remaining itself absent. As Heidegger explains, unconcealment grants first of all the possibility of the path to presence, and grants the possible presencing of the present itself. This temporal structure means that being cannot be grasped, possessed, or fully revealed. It shows itself only by concealing itself, offers itself only by withdrawing. The moment we try to capture being in concepts or representations, we lose what is most essential about it. Being's self-showing is simultaneously a self-concealing. Its revelation, a hiddenness. Thinking being, therefore requires a fundamental transformation of thought itself. We must move beyond representational thinking that attempts to capture being in concepts toward what Heidegger calls meditative openness to being's own movement of self-showing and self-concealing. This is thinking as the thinking of being, where thinking learns to belong to being rather than trying to master it. Such thinking does not impose frameworks upon being, but allows itself to be claimed by being's own temporal unfolding. This reveals the essential relationship between being and human existence, not as subject knowing object, but as mutual belonging, in what Heidegger calls the event of appropriation. This mutual belonging proves more primordial than either being or human existence considered as separate entities, pointing toward their original unity in the temporal happening of unconcealment itself. Heidegger's final philosophical venture leads us to what he calls the event of appropriation, or ereignis, his ultimate attempt to think the mutual belonging of being and human existence without reducing either to the other or treating their relationship as merely accidental. In Time and Being, Heidegger offers this remarkable formulation: appropriation appropriates man and being over to their essential togetherness. We shall call this appropriation, ereignis. This event names not something that happens within time, but the more primordial happening within which both time and being emerge as essentially belonging together. The word ereignis itself carries profound significance in German, suggesting both event and appropriation, but also containing the root eigen, meaning own or proper. Heidegger exploits this linguistic richness to indicate how being and human existence come into their own precisely through their mutual appropriation. This is not an event we can observe from outside, as if we could step back and watch being and humanity enter into relationship. Rather, we are always already within this event, constituted by it, unable to think ourselves or being apart from it. What makes this appropriation so radical is that it reveals both being and human existence as essentially relational rather than self-sufficient. Being needs human existence as the site where it can come to unconcealment, where beings can be disclosed in their being. Without Dasein's fundamental openness, being would remain forever concealed, unable to manifest itself. But equally, human existence is essentially grounded in its relationship to being as the source of all meaning and significance. Heidegger captures this mutual dependence. Appropriation brings man and being into their essential togetherness. This mutual need transforms our understanding completely. Neither being nor Dasein exists independently, and then subsequently enters into relationship. Rather, both emerge within and as the event of appropriation itself. Being gives itself only through human existence's capacity for understanding, whilst human existence receives its essential nature only through its openness to being's self-disclosure. This is why Heidegger can say that the relation of man and being is appropriation itself. The appropriation involves being's need for human existence as the clearing where beings can be unconcealed, and human existence's essential grounding in its relationship to being. Heidegger expresses this through the striking image. Man is used for the safekeeping of the truth of being. Man is the shepherd of being. This shepherding involves neither passive reception of being's gifts nor active control over being's manifestation, but responsive correspondence to being's own movement of giving and withdrawing. As shepherds of being, we neither create truth nor simply receive it ready-made. Instead, we participate in truth's happening by maintaining the clearing within which beings can show themselves as they are. This requires what Heidegger calls thinking, which is not the calculative reasoning of metaphysics, but a more primordial attentiveness to being's own movements. Such thinking lets being be, rather than trying to grasp or master it. Understanding this mutual belonging transforms both our relationship to being and our understanding of human existence. By revealing them as co-emergent within the event of appropriation, we cannot step outside this event to examine it objectively, because we are constituted by it. Our very capacity to think and question emerges from within appropriation's happening. This recognition points toward possibilities for future thinking that can inhabit this mutual belonging without trying to master or explain it. The event of appropriation thus opens the question of what authentic thought and dwelling might look like beyond the completion of metaphysics. In technological enframing, if we can learn to think from within appropriation rather than trying to stand outside it, we might discover ways of existing that correspond more faithfully to being's own movements of revealing and concealing, opening possibilities for thought that technological calculation cannot reach. The completion of metaphysics in technological enframing opens the possibility for a new beginning of thought precisely because the total concealment of being in technology makes this concealment visible as concealment, remaining invisible. When being withdraws completely into the machinery of calculation and control, this withdrawal becomes manifest in a way that was impossible during earlier epochs of metaphysical thinking. As Heidegger observes, the completion of metaphysics begins with Hegel's metaphysics of absolute knowledge as the spirit of will. Technology represents not just one more epoch, but the end of the metaphysical tradition that began with Plato, creating the possibility for thinking that is no longer metaphysical. This technological completion reveals something essential about the entire metaphysical tradition. From Plato's forms through medieval theology to modern subjectivity, metaphysics has consistently understood being as presence, as something that can be grasped, represented, and ultimately controlled by human thinking. Technology simply brings this tendency to its logical conclusion, transforming everything into standing reserve available for calculation and manipulation. Yet precisely in this total transformation, the question of being emerges with new urgency because the technological world cannot account for its own essence. This new thinking cannot be planned, produced, or guaranteed through human effort, but must be prepared through patient, meditative reflection that remains open to being's possible self-giving in new ways. As Heidegger writes in The Principle of Reason, we cannot force the advent of this other thinking, but we can work toward preparing for it. This preparation involves learning to inhabit the end of metaphysics without either despairing over the loss of traditional certainties or attempting to restore them through willful assertion. Such preparation requires a fundamental shift in our relationship to thinking itself. Rather than approaching thought as a tool for solving problems or achieving goals, we must learn to think as a way of corresponding to being's essential mystery. This involves what Heidegger calls meditative thinking, as opposed to calculative thinking. Meditative thinking does not seek to master or control, but to listen and respond to what shows itself in its own terms. The preparation involves learning to dwell authentically within the tensions of existence, rather than seeking final solutions or systematic explanations that would eliminate mystery and finitude. Heidegger speaks of dwelling in the nearness of being as involving the step back from the thinking that merely represents, that is, explains, to the thinking that responds and recalls. This step back opens space for wonder and questioning that neither metaphysical philosophy nor technological calculation can provide. This dwelling requires accepting the essential finitude of human existence without treating this finitude as a limitation to be overcome. Traditional metaphysics has consistently sought to transcend finitude through appeals to eternal truths, absolute knowledge, or technological mastery. The new thinking must learn to inhabit finitude as the very condition that makes authentic thinking possible. Only finite beings can genuinely question and wonder, because only they encounter being as mystery rather than possession. The future of thinking depends on recovering the capacity for wonder and essential questioning that opens us to being's mystery rather than seeking to eliminate mystery through explanation or control. Heidegger returns to the Greek concept of wonder, Dasein, as the tuning in which the thinking of the early Greek thinkers was tuned. This wonder involves neither naive amazement nor sophisticated curiosity, but the fundamental attunement that recognizes being as the most questionable and worthy of thought. This wonder emerges when we truly encounter the strangeness of the fact that anything exists at all, rather than nothing. The technological world obscures this fundamental mystery by treating existence as obvious and unquestionable, as simply the raw material for human projects. Recovering wonder means learning to see through this obviousness to the essential mystery that sustains all particular beings whilst remaining itself concealed. Such thinking points toward a future that can correspond to being's essential mystery, whilst remaining committed to rigorous inquiry into what it means for anything to be at all. Part 13. Conclusion. Heidegger's philosophical journey reveals itself as a sustained meditation on the most fundamental question that Western thinking has forgotten: the question of being itself. From his early existential analytic through his later meditations on technology and dwelling, every stage deepens rather than abandons this central inquiry. The question of being aims at ascertaining the a priori conditions not only for the possibility of the sciences which examine beings as beings of such and such a type, and, in so doing, already operate with an understanding of being, but also for the possibility of those ontologies themselves, which are prior to the ontic sciences, and which provide their foundations. This retrospective assessment illuminates how the analysis of Dasein in Being and Time, the critique of technological enframing, and the vision of authentic dwelling all serve the same fundamental purpose: awakening thought to the forgotten question that grounds all questioning. The unity of Heidegger's thinking emerges most clearly in his persistent insight that authentic existence requires embracing rather than overcoming human finitude, the early analysis of authentic resoluteness toward death, and the later thinking of being's essential withdrawal both reveal the same essential structure. Meaning emerges through limitation, not despite it. Anxiety discloses the groundlessness of everyday certainties. Conscience calls Dasein back from the comforting illusions of the they-self. Mortality reveals existence as essentially temporal and finite. The call of language summons thinking beyond the boundaries of representational concepts. The mystery of the Fourfold preserves the essential hiddenness within all revealing. Each phenomenon points toward the same fundamental truth. Authentic human existence finds itself not through mastery or permanent presence, but through learning to correspond to its essential limitations. This correspondence transforms the very meaning of human existence. The essence of man is determined by the relationship of being to man, and man occurs essentially in such a way that he is the there, that is, the clearing of being. These insights reveal human existence not as the master of beings, but as the guardian of being's truth, responsible for preserving the openness within which beings can show themselves. The path from individual authenticity through the critique of enframing to poetic dwelling demonstrates how authentic existence must learn to correspond to being's own movement of revealing and concealing rather than imposing human categories of understanding and control. This is why Heidegger's thinking moves beyond the subject-object framework that has dominated Western philosophy. Authentic existence discovers itself as belonging to being's own self-disclosure. The vision of authentic dwelling within the Fourfold offers not a program for action, but a transformed understanding of what it means to exist thoughtfully. Heidegger's concept of thinking as building and dwelling as the basic character of being points toward possibilities for post-technological ways of being human that neither reject modernity nor submit completely to technological enframing. Instead, this thinking learns to inhabit the tension between technological necessity and other ways of revealing. Such dwelling preserves space for wonder, for the essential questionableness of existence, for ways of being that allow beings to show themselves beyond the narrow framework of calculable utility. This transformed understanding prepares for thinking and dwelling that can correspond to being's essential mystery whilst remaining committed to authentic existence within the finite, temporal, and essentially questionable character of human existence. The forgetting of being is not simply an intellectual error to be corrected, but the fundamental condition from which authentic thinking must begin. Only by thinking through this forgetting, by experiencing the withdrawal of being within the very dominance of beings, can thought prepare for a more original relationship to the mystery that grounds all existence. Heidegger's philosophy thus culminates not in answers, but in a deepened capacity for questioning that honors both the urgency of human existence and the inexhaustible mystery within which all existence unfolds.